Hello, dear hunter. Welcome back to another journey through the ancient, blood-soaked streets of Yharnam. Tonight, we're going to explore one of the most tragic and pivotal figures in all of Bloodborne's intricate lore, Laurence, the first vicar of the Healing Church. Get comfortable now. Settle into your bed, adjust your pillows, and let yourself relax completely. This is a long tale, filled with ambition, tragedy, and cosmic horror. But don't worry, we'll take our time. Every detail, every moment of Laurence's journey from idealistic scholar to burning beast will unfold slowly, gently, like pages turning in an ancient tome. The rain falls softly outside the windows of Yharnam tonight. Somewhere in the distance, church bells toll a mournful melody. The streets are empty now, quiet except for the whisper of wind through abandoned alleyways. This is the perfect time for stories, for remembering those who came before, whose choices shaped the nightmare we now inhabit. Laurence's story begins not in the grand cathedrals of Yharnam, but in the scholarly halls of Byrgenwerth. It begins with hope, with dreams of healing and human transcendence. It begins, as so many tragedies do, with the very best of intentions. Before we dive deep into his tale, let me paint you a picture of the world Laurence inhabited. Imagine, if you will, a time before the hunt, before the streets ran red with the blood of beasts, before the moon hung low and pale, calling out to those with eyes to see. There was a time when Yharnam was simply a city, when scholars pursued knowledge for its own sake, when the old blood was nothing more than a mysterious substance waiting to be discovered in the depths below. This was the world into which Laurence stepped as a young man. A world of possibility. A world where human ambition had not yet met its cosmic match. A world that would be forever changed by his decisions, his vision, and ultimately, his hubris. Take a deep breath now. Let your shoulders drop. Release any tension you're holding. As we journey through Laurence's life, let his story wash over you like a gentle tide. There's no need to remember every detail. Just let the narrative carry you, like a current, deeper and deeper into relaxation. The tale of Laurence is, at its heart, a cautionary one. It speaks to the danger of noble intentions corrupted by forces beyond human understanding. It reminds us that knowledge, without wisdom, can lead to ruin. And it shows us that even the most brilliant minds can be consumed by the very forces they sought to control. But it's also a deeply human story. Laurence was not a villain in the traditional sense. He was not motivated by cruelty or malice. He genuinely believed he could make the world better. He saw suffering and sought to end it. He witnessed human limitation and dreamed of transcendence. In another world, under different circumstances, he might have been remembered as a hero, a savior, a visionary who changed everything for the better. Instead, his name is forever linked with corruption, transformation, and eternal damnation. His skull sits upon an altar in the Grand Cathedral, venerated by those who do not understand the true horror of his fate. And his burning form remains trapped in the hunter's nightmare, suffering endlessly for sins he could not have fully comprehended when he committed them. So settle in deeper now. Let your eyelids grow heavy. As we explore each chapter of Laurence's existence, allow yourself to drift, to float, to surrender to the gentle rhythm of this tale. The story is long, but time has no meaning here, in this quiet space we've created together. Let us begin at the beginning, in the scholarly halls of Byrgenwerth, where a young man with brilliant eyes and an even brighter mind first learned of the mysteries that would consume his life, his humanity, and ultimately, his very soul. In the quiet, lamplit halls of Byrgenwerth College, where ancient tomes lined endless shelves and scholars debated cosmic mysteries late into the night, there walked a young man named Laurence. He moved through these halls with purpose, his mind always working, always questioning, always reaching for understanding, just beyond his grasp. Byrgenwerth was more than just a college. It was a sanctuary for those who sought to push beyond the boundaries of conventional knowledge. Under the guidance of Provost Willem, these scholars pursued truths that others dared not contemplate. They studied the ruins of ancient civilizations buried deep beneath the earth. They gazed at the stars, seeking patterns in the cosmic dance above. They asked questions that had no easy answers, and they were unafraid of what those answers might reveal. Master Willem himself was a figure of profound wisdom and caution. Elderly even then, he sat in his chair by the moonlit lake, contemplating mysteries that would drive lesser minds to madness. His philosophy was one of patience, of gradual enlightenment through insight. He taught his students to develop what he called eyes on the inside, a form of perception that could see beyond the veil of ordinary reality, into the cosmic truths that lay hidden from mortal sight. Among all of Willem's students, Laurence shone brightest. His mind was sharp, his dedication absolute. Where other scholars might spend weeks pondering a single question, Laurence would work tirelessly, approaching problems from every conceivable angle until he found his answer. He was not content with surface understanding. He needed to know the why of things, the deeper mechanisms that governed existence itself. The relationship between Willem and Laurence was complex from the beginning. There was genuine affection there. The old master saw in his young student a reflection of his own passionate pursuit of knowledge. Willem treated Laurence almost as a son, grooming him for greatness, sharing insights with him that he withheld from others. But there was also tension, an underlying disagreement about methodology and purpose that would eventually drive them apart. You see, Willem believed that true transcendence came through understanding, through developing one's perception to the point where cosmic truths became visible. It was a slow process, requiring years of study, meditation, and careful observation. He preached caution above all else, warning his students that the forces they studied were far beyond human ability to control. Knowledge was to be gained gradually, respectfully, with full awareness of human limitations. Laurence, for all his brilliance, was younger, more impatient. He saw the suffering in the world beyond Byrgenwerth's walls. He witnessed disease, injury, the slow decay of mortal flesh, and he believed that knowledge without application was hollow, meaningless. What good was understanding cosmic truth if it couldn't be used to improve human existence? What value did enlightenment hold if it remained locked away in scholarly towers while people suffered below? This fundamental difference in perspective would become the fault line along which their relationship would eventually fracture. But in those early days, the disagreement remained mostly philosophical, confined to academic debates rather than personal conflict. Among Laurence's fellow students were others who would go on to shape Yharnam's dark future. There was Michaelash, whose brilliance was matched only by his obsession with making contact with the Great Ones. There was Gehrman, who brought a warrior's practical perspective to their theoretical discussions. These men formed a circle within Byrgenwerth, united by their belief that more direct action was needed if humanity was to evolve beyond its current limitations. Late into the night, they would gather in shadowed corners of the college library, speaking in hushed tones about possibilities that Willem would have discouraged. They discussed ways to bridge the gap between human and cosmic, to accelerate the process of transcendence, to harness forces that their master believed should only be observed and understood, never touched or manipulated. It was during this period of late-night theorizing and passionate debate that Byrgenwerth made its most significant discovery. Deep within the ancient Thumerian tombs that lay beneath the earth, carved by a civilization long since fallen to ruin, the scholars uncovered something extraordinary, something that would change everything. The discovery itself was unremarkable at first, just another artifact recovered from the endless labyrinths below. But as the scholars began to study this crimson substance, they realized they had found something truly unique. This blood possessed properties unlike anything in the natural world. It could heal wounds with remarkable speed. It granted enhanced strength and vitality to those who consumed it, and it seemed to open pathways of perception, allowing glimpses of cosmic truths that normally remained hidden from mortal eyes. For Willem, the discovery of the old blood was a moment of profound fear. Despite its obvious potential, he sensed immediately that this substance was dangerous in ways his students could not comprehend. The blood felt wrong to him. It carried within it influences and tendencies that spoke of cosmic forces far beyond human understanding or control. His response was immediate and unequivocal. Fear, the old blood. These 4 words became Byrgenwerth's new watchword, a warning that Willem hoped would prevent his students from making a terrible mistake. He forbade direct experimentation with the blood, limiting their study to careful observation and analysis. He spoke of ancient civilizations that had fallen to similar temptations, pointing to the ruins of the Thumerians themselves as evidence of what happened when humans delved too deep into cosmic mysteries. But Laurence looked at the old blood and saw something entirely different. Where Willem saw danger, Laurence saw salvation. Where his master counseled fear, Laurence felt hope burning in his chest like a flame. The blood's healing properties were undeniable. A single drop could mend wounds that would normally take weeks to heal. Small doses granted strength and vitality that could transform the weak into the strong, the sick into the healthy. To Laurence, this seemed like divine providence. A gift from the cosmos, meant to elevate humanity to new heights. How could something with such obvious benefits be dangerous? How could the careful application of this remarkable substance lead to anything but human improvement? The debates between master and student grew more heated as Laurence's convictions strengthened. Willem would speak of caution, of unknown consequences, of the price that must inevitably be paid when mortals tamper with cosmic forces. Laurence would counter with practical arguments. People were suffering, dying from diseases that the old blood could cure. Was it not their responsibility as scholars to use their knowledge to help those in need? These arguments took place in Willem's study, in shadowed corners of the library, during long walks along the moonlit lake. The old master would gesture toward the ruins visible in the distance, reminding Laurence that the Thumerians too had possessed the old blood, and look what had become of them. Their mighty civilization reduced to crumbling stones and wandering specters, their bodies twisted into monstrous forms by forces they could not control. But Laurence was convinced that the Thumerians had failed because they lacked understanding, not because the blood itself was inherently dangerous. With proper knowledge and careful application, he believed, the old blood could be used safely. Humanity could succeed where previous civilizations had fallen. They were smarter now, more enlightened. They would not repeat the mistakes of the past. As the tension between them grew, other students began to take sides. Some remained loyal to Willem's caution, believing that their master's wisdom came from depths of understanding they had not yet reached. Others gravitated toward Laurence's vision, drawn by the promise of practical application and tangible results. The college began to fracture along ideological lines, scholarly unity giving way to competing camps with fundamentally different views on the purpose and application of knowledge. The final break came not in a single dramatic moment, but through a series of increasingly heated exchanges that made continued cooperation impossible. Laurence announced his intention to leave Byrgenwerth and pursue his own path with the old blood. Willem, feeling betrayed by the student he had nurtured like a son, spoke the word that would forever define their separation: betrayal. In response, Laurence offered words that have echoed through the ages, preserved in the very skull that would later sit upon the healing church's altar. No, but you will never listen. I tell you, I will not forget our adage. It was a promise meant to reassure, an attempt to tell his master that he would remember the warning, that he would proceed with caution even as he pursued the old blood's potential. But even as Laurence spoke these words, both men must have sensed the futility of such promises. The allure of the blood was too strong, its benefits too obvious, and Laurence's vision too grand to be constrained by fear. When Laurence finally departed Byrgenwerth, he did not go alone. Several like-minded scholars chose to follow him, forming the core of what would become the healing church. They left behind the quiet halls where they had studied, the moonlit lake where they had contemplated cosmic mysteries, and the wise old master who had taught them everything they knew. They left with hope in their hearts and dreams of changing the world. Behind them, Willem remained in his chair, gazing at the moon reflected in the still waters of the lake. The old scholar would maintain his vigil for years to come, watching, waiting, and perhaps hoping against hope that his former student would remember the adage that had bound them together. But the wheels of fate were already in motion, and neither master nor student could foresee the full extent of the horror that Laurence's ambitions would unleash. The young man who walked away from Byrgenwerth that day was full of conviction and determination. He believed absolutely in his ability to harness the old blood's power while avoiding its dangers. He envisioned a future where disease and suffering would be eliminated, where humanity would evolve beyond its current limitations through the careful application of blood ministration. What Laurence could not have known, could not have possibly foreseen, was how completely his noble intentions would be corrupted by the very forces he sought to control. The path from idealistic scholar to founding father of a religious institution would prove more treacherous than any young academic could imagine. The separation between Laurence and Master Willem was not simply an academic disagreement or a professional parting of ways. It represented a fundamental schism in how humanity should approach the cosmic mysteries that lay hidden in the world's dark corners. This philosophical divide would shape not just their personal destinies, but the fate of entire civilizations. Let yourself sink deeper into comfort now, as we explore this crucial moment. Feel the weight of your body pressing into the mattress. Notice how your breath flows in and out, slow and steady, like waves upon a distant shore. The story continues, gentle and unhurried. In the days following Laurence's announcement of his departure, the atmosphere at Byrgenwerth grew heavy with unspoken tension. The other scholars could feel the weight of what was happening. This was not merely one student leaving to pursue his own research. This was the beginning of something larger, a fundamental split that would create two competing visions of humanity's future. Willem, despite his disappointment and sense of betrayal, did not rage or attempt to prevent Laurence's departure through force or institutional authority. The old provost understood that such methods would be futile. Laurence's mind was made up, his conviction unshakable. To try to hold him by force would only embitter the young scholar further and validate his belief that Willem's caution was actually closed-mindedness. Instead, Willem simply watched as his most promising student prepared to leave. He observed as Laurence gathered his research notes, his personal belongings, the samples of old blood he had managed to secure despite Willem's prohibitions. The old master's eyes were sad but resigned, like a father watching his child make a choice he knows will lead to suffering, but cannot prevent. In those final days before departure, there were moments when the two men could almost recapture their old warmth. Brief exchanges in hallways, shared silences in the library, moments when the weight of their shared history threatened to overcome their current disagreement. But these moments never lasted. The philosophical chasm between them was too wide, too fundamental to be bridged by sentiment or nostalgia. Other students watched this drama unfold with various reactions. Some, loyal to Willem, viewed Laurence's departure with disapproval or even disdain. To them, he was abandoning his teacher and his principles for the sake of ambition and pride. They believed Willem's warnings about the old blood and feared that Laurence's recklessness would bring catastrophe. Others, however, felt the pull of Laurence's vision. They too had grown frustrated with Willem's endless caution, his refusal to pursue practical applications of their discoveries. They had seen the old blood's potential with their own eyes and could not understand why they should fear something that offered such obvious benefits to humanity. For these students, Laurence represented hope, progress, and the courage to act on conviction rather than hiding behind academic timidity. Michaelash was among those drawn to Laurence's vision, though his own obsessions would eventually lead him down an even darker path. Gehrman, too, chose to follow, bringing with him a warrior's practical skills that would prove invaluable in the years to come. These men and others formed the core group that would leave Byrgenwerth with Laurence, establishing the foundation of what would become the Healing Church. The actual moment of departure was quiet, undramatic. There was no formal ceremony, no grand speeches or emotional farewells. Laurence and his followers simply packed their belongings, secured their research materials, and walked out through Byrgenwerth's gates on a grey morning when mist hung low over the lake. As they walked away, Laurence looked back once at the college that had been his home for so many years. He could see Willem's silhouette sitting in his chair by the lake, perfectly still, gazing at waters that reflected the pale morning sky. The old master did not turn to watch them go. Perhaps he could not bear to see it. Perhaps he was already lost in contemplation of cosmic truths that transcended such earthly concerns as students leaving or staying. Laurence felt a pang of, not regret, exactly, but a deep sadness at the necessity of this separation. He had loved Willem, had respected him more than any other person in his life. The old scholar had taught him everything about how to think, how to question, how to pursue truth through the darkness of ignorance. But ultimately, Laurence believed his teacher had taught him too well. Willem had shown him how to think for himself, and that independent thinking had led him to conclusions different from those of his master. The journey from Byrgenwerth to Yharnam took several days, giving Laurence and his companions time to discuss and refine their plans. They traveled through countryside still untouched by the corruption that would later spread from Yharnam like a plague. Villages they passed through were ordinary places where people lived ordinary lives, unaware that momentous events were unfolding that would eventually touch them all. During these travels, Laurence began to articulate more clearly the vision that would guide the healing church's establishment. He spoke of blood ministration not just as a medical technique but as a sacred practice, a means by which humanity could commune with higher forces and evolve beyond its current limitations. He described a church that would serve both spiritual and practical needs, offering healing for the body alongside guidance for the soul. Gehrman listened to these plans with his characteristic quiet pragmatism. He understood that Laurence's grand vision would require protection, both from external threats and from the potential dangers posed by the old blood itself. Even then, before the beast scourge had manifested, Gehrman sensed that they would need hunters, individuals skilled in combat, and dedicated to dealing with whatever problems might arise from blood ministration. This foresight would prove crucial in the years to come. As they drew closer to Yharnam, Laurence felt his excitement building. This was the beginning of everything he had dreamed of. Here, in this city built above ancient ruins, he would establish something new, an institution dedicated to improving human existence through the careful application of cosmic knowledge. He would succeed where others had failed. He would prove that Willem's caution, while well-intentioned, was ultimately unnecessary. The Yharnam they first encountered was not the nightmare city of later years. It was a relatively prosperous settlement, known for the ancient Thumerian ruins that lay beneath it, but otherwise unremarkable. The citizens were hard-working people who faced the ordinary challenges of medieval life: disease, injury, poverty, the constant struggle to survive in a world that offered few guarantees. These were the people Laurence intended to help, not as an academic exercise or scholarly experiment, but as a genuine mission to reduce suffering and improve lives. Whatever his flaws, whatever mistakes he would make, this core motivation remained pure. Laurence truly believed he could make the world better, and he was willing to dedicate his life to that purpose. Looking back now, from our perspective centuries later, we can see the terrible irony of that moment. Laurence arrived in Yharnam with hope and healing, intending to establish an institution that would benefit all humanity. Instead, he would unleash forces that would transform the city into a nightmare of blood and beasts, a place where the very concept of humanity would become contested and the boundary between human and monster would blur until it was almost invisible. But in that moment, as Laurence first walked through Yharnam's streets, such dark futures were unimaginable. The sun was shining, people went about their daily business, and a young scholar with brilliant eyes and a heart full of conviction began to plan how he would change the world. Behind him, back at Byrgenwerth, Willem sat by his lake, gazing at the reflection of the sky in still waters. The old master spoke 4 words that would echo through the ages, a warning that would prove terrifyingly prophetic: fear the old blood. But Laurence was too far away to hear them now. And even if he had heard, it's doubtful he would have listened. He had made his choice, set his course, and nothing would turn him aside from the path he had chosen. The great schism was complete. Master and student had parted ways, perhaps forever. And the stage was set for tragedy on a cosmic scale. The establishment of the healing church did not happen overnight. Laurence understood with the strategic insight that would make him a formidable leader, that revolutionary ideas required careful preparation and gradual acceptance. You cannot simply arrive in a city and announce that you possess miraculous healing blood without arousing suspicion, skepticism, or outright hostility. So he began slowly, methodically. Let your breathing slow now as we explore these early days. Feel your muscles relaxing, one by one, as Laurence's careful plans unfold. The first step was establishing credibility. Laurence and his companions presented themselves not as radical revolutionaries, but as learned men devoted to medicine and human welfare. They opened a modest clinic in a quiet district of Yharnam, offering their services to those who could not afford traditional healers. They asked for nothing in return, positioning themselves as charitable scholars who had left their academic towers to serve the common people. The initial treatments were conservative, almost mundane. Herbal remedies, advice on hygiene and diet, basic wound care that any competent healer could provide. Laurence was building trust, establishing relationships, demonstrating that he and his followers were genuinely concerned with helping people rather than pursuing their own mysterious agenda. Only gradually, after weeks of this careful groundwork, did Laurence begin to introduce the concept of blood ministration, and even then, he started with the most desperate cases. Patients who had exhausted all other options, whose conditions were terminal, who had nothing to lose by trying an experimental treatment. For these individuals, blood ministration seemed like a miracle. Wounds that should have taken months to heal closed in days. Diseases that had resisted all other treatments simply vanished. Patients who had been confined to bed found themselves restored to vitality and strength. Word of these miraculous healings began to spread. At first slowly, as rumors passed between neighbors and friends. Then more rapidly, as more patients experienced the remarkable benefits of blood ministration. People began traveling from other districts, other towns, seeking out this mysterious healer who seemed capable of curing anything. The modest clinic became overwhelmed with patients, forcing Laurence to expand his operations and recruit additional staff. It was during this period of rapid growth that Laurence began to introduce the religious framework that would define the healing church. He spoke of the old blood not just as a medical tool, but as a sacred substance, a divine gift meant to elevate humanity. He developed rituals around its administration, combining scientific procedure with spiritual symbolism in ways that made the treatments seem both legitimate and mystical. The name Healing Church itself was deliberately chosen to emphasize the organization's dual nature, part medical institution, part religious order. This hybrid structure proved enormously effective. It appealed to people's spiritual yearnings while also offering tangible, practical benefits, and it gave Laurence a framework for organizing his growing number of followers into a coherent institutional structure. As first vicar of this new church, Laurence wielded considerable authority. The title was not merely ceremonial. It represented genuine spiritual and temporal power over a growing congregation. Laurence took these responsibilities seriously, seeing himself as a shepherd guiding humanity toward a brighter future. He preached sermons about transcendence and human evolution. He developed doctrine explaining how blood ministration fit into a larger divine plan. And he worked tirelessly to expand the church's reach and influence. The cornerstone of the church's appeal remained blood ministration itself. The results were simply too dramatic to be ignored or dismissed. People who had been written off as incurable found themselves restored to health. The elderly regained vitality they had not felt in decades. The weak became strong. It seemed, in those early days, that Laurence had truly discovered a miracle, that the church offered more than just physical healing. Laurence recognized that to truly transform society, his organization needed to address all aspects of human existence. The church established schools where children could learn to read and write, charitable institutions that provided for the poor and desperate, and centers of learning that rivaled even Byrgenwerth in their scope and ambition. This holistic approach to human welfare helped the church grow rapidly in both size and influence. Within a few years, the modest clinic had evolved into a major institution with facilities throughout Yharnam. The church employed hundreds of people, doctors and scholars, yes, but also teachers, administrators, craftsmen, laborers, and eventually hunters who would ensure the church's operations could continue without interference. The construction of the Grand Cathedral represented the culmination of this early growth period. Laurence had dreamed of a building that would serve as both the physical and spiritual center of his church, a place where the faithful could gather to worship and where the most important blood ministration ceremonies could be performed. The cathedral that rose from those dreams was magnificent. Soaring spires that reached toward the heavens, stained glass windows that painted the interior in jeweled light, vast halls that could accommodate hundreds of worshippers. At the heart of the cathedral was the altar, the sacred space where blood ministration was elevated from mere medical procedure to divine sacrament. It was here that new members were formally initiated into the church, here that Laurence delivered his most important sermons, and here that the church's leadership would later venerate Laurence's own skull after his transformation and death. The altar was designed with great care, incorporating symbolism that spoke to both the medical and spiritual aspects of the church's mission. Blood-red fabrics draped across stone surfaces, ceremonial vessels held the precious old blood, and everywhere imagery of transcendence and evolution, of humanity reaching beyond its current limitations towards something greater. As the church grew, so too did its organizational complexity. Below Laurence, as first vicar, were various ranks of clergy, each with specific responsibilities. The white-garbed doctors represented the church's medical mission, continuing research into blood ministration and its applications. The black-garbed hunters, established under German's leadership, served as the church's martial arm, protecting its operations and dealing with any problems that arose. At the highest levels of the church hierarchy emerged the choir, a select group of scholars dedicated to understanding the cosmic implications of their work. These individuals, many of whom had followed Laurence from Byrgenwerth, pursued research into the Great Ones, those alien intelligences that existed beyond human comprehension, but whose influence could be felt in phenomena like the old blood. The choir's research was kept secret from ordinary church members and the general public. Laurence understood that speaking openly about communion with cosmic entities would frighten people and undermine the church's carefully crafted public image as a benevolent medical and spiritual institution. But privately, among the church's elite, there was growing interest in pursuing transcendence, not just through blood ministration, but through direct contact with the Great Ones themselves. The church's relationship with Yharnam's existing power structures evolved gradually from cooperation to dominance. Initially, Laurence was careful not to challenge secular authorities directly. He framed the church as a supplement to existing institutions, focusing on areas where it could provide unique value without threatening established interests. This diplomatic approach allowed the church to grow rapidly without triggering organized opposition from nobles, merchants, or other influential groups. However, as the church's success and influence expanded, it inevitably began to reshape Yharnam's social and political landscape. Traditional healers found themselves increasingly irrelevant as more and more people turned to blood ministration. Other religious institutions struggled to compete with the church's combination of tangible miracles and compelling theology. Local authorities discovered that their citizens looked to the church for guidance and support on an ever-widening range of issues. Laurence navigated these challenges with considerable political skill. He forged alliances with influential nobles and merchants, often providing healing services to secure their support. He was careful to frame the church's growing power as a natural evolution rather than a hostile takeover, emphasizing cooperation and mutual benefit whenever possible. This approach allowed the church to accumulate power without generating the kind of organized opposition that might have stopped or slowed its expansion. The economic impact of the healing church on Yharnam was profound. The influx of pilgrims seeking healing brought tremendous wealth to the city. Merchants prospered from selling goods and services to these visitors. Craftsmen found steady work constructing church buildings and producing the elaborate equipment used in blood ministration ceremonies. The church itself became one of the city's largest employers, providing steady income for thousands of families. This economic transformation helped cement the church's position in Yharnam society. The city's prosperity became dependent on the church's success, making opposition to its growing influence economically risky. Even those who might have had doubts about blood ministration or the Church's theology had practical reasons to support or at least tolerate its operations. During this period of growth and success, Laurence must have felt vindicated in his decision to leave Byrgenwerth. His vision of using the old blood to benefit humanity appeared to be succeeding beyond his wildest dreams. The suffering that blood ministration alleviated, the lives it saved, and the hope it provided seemed to justify any risks or concerns Willem might have raised. Yet even in these triumphant early days, there were subtle signs of the dangers to come. Some patients who received blood ministration reported strange dreams or visions. Others described feeling unusually aggressive or experiencing cravings they could not explain. These side effects were rare and generally mild, easily dismissed as temporary adjustments to the treatment. Laurence and his colleagues noted these phenomena, but concluded they were acceptable trade-offs for the blood's remarkable benefits. What they did not yet understand, could not yet see, was that these minor side effects were actually early symptoms of a much deeper transformation. The old blood was not simply healing the body or enhancing physical capabilities.
Sechs Viertels really, sie verfälscher. Überrömet exemplaire. Del taxable reader. Already others exwines. Orientales, Hertiles sur. Argmiotex.
It was fundamentally altering those who received it, creating connections between them and cosmic forces that operated according to logic beyond human comprehension. But such dark revelations still lay in the future. For now, the healing church stood as a monument to human ambition and achievement. Laurence had accomplished something extraordinary. He had taken knowledge gained in Byrgenwerth's scholarly halls and transformed it into an institution that genuinely helped thousands of people. The young idealist who had left Willem's side with hope in his heart had made his dreams reality. Or so it seemed. The foundation of the church represented both Laurence's greatest achievement and the beginning of his ultimate downfall. He had opened a door that he believed led to paradise, but he had unknowingly invited something far more dangerous into his carefully constructed world. Let us delve deeper now into the practice that defined the healing church's early years, blood ministration itself. Feel yourself sinking further into relaxation as we explore this central element of Laurence's vision. Your breathing is slow and steady. Your body is completely at rest. The story continues to unfold, gentle as moonlight. Blood ministration was, at its core, deceptively simple. It involved the careful administration of the old blood to patients suffering from various ailments. The process had been refined through months of careful experimentation and observation, transformed from crude attempts into an elaborate ritual that combined medical procedure with spiritual symbolism. The blood used in these treatments was harvested from deep within the Thumerian ruins beneath Yharnam. Church expeditions would descend into those ancient labyrinths, navigating dangers both physical and cosmic, to reach the sources of the old blood. These expeditions were dangerous, costly endeavors that required both scholarly knowledge and martial skill, but the rewards justified the risks. Each successful expedition could provide enough blood to treat hundreds of patients. Once harvested, the blood underwent careful preparation. Church scholars had developed techniques for purifying, concentrating, and preserving the blood to maximize its beneficial properties while supposedly minimizing risks. Different preparations were created for different purposes, some optimized for healing wounds, others for curing disease, still others for enhancing physical capabilities. The actual administration of blood to patients was conducted with great ceremony. Patients would first undergo a period of preparation, including fasting, prayer, and ritual cleansing. This preparation served both practical and psychological purposes. It helped ensure the patient's body was ready to receive the blood, while also creating a sense of reverence and importance around the treatment. On the day of treatment, patients would be brought to one of the church's ceremonial chambers. These rooms were designed to inspire awe and faith, high ceilings, elaborate religious imagery, and always, the soft glow of lamps that cast everything in warm, golden light. The atmosphere was carefully crafted to make patients feel they were participating in something sacred, something transformative. Church doctors would conduct the actual procedure, dressed in white ceremonial garments that signified their role as intermediaries between the divine blood and suffering humanity. They would use special vessels and implements, all elaborately decorated with religious symbolism, to measure and administer the precise amount of blood required for each patient's specific condition. The blood itself was often mixed with other substances, sacred oils, blessed water, herbal preparations that church scholars believed would enhance its effectiveness or reduce side effects. These additions were based on both genuine medical research and religious tradition, creating treatments that existed at the intersection of science and faith. As the blood was administered, usually through injection or ingestion, prayers would be recited. These prayers spoke of healing and transcendence, of the patient's body being purified and elevated through contact with this sacred substance. The words were carefully chosen to reinforce the theological framework Laurence had built around blood ministration, the idea that this was not merely medicine, but a form of communion with higher forces. The immediate effects of blood ministration were often dramatic. Patients would report feeling a warmth spreading through their body, a sense of vitality and strength flowing into previously weak or diseased flesh. Wounds would visibly begin to close. Fevers would break. Pain would fade. For many patients, the experience was genuinely transcendent. They felt not just healed, but transformed, touched by something divine. In the days following treatment, the benefits would continue to manifest. Injuries that should have required months of recovery would heal in weeks or even days. Diseases that had resisted all other treatments would simply disappear, as if they had never existed. Patients who had been weak or elderly would find themselves possessed of strength and vitality they hadn't felt in years. These remarkable results generated enormous enthusiasm and loyalty among those who experienced blood ministration firsthand. Patients became evangelists for the church, sharing their experiences with friends, family, and anyone who would listen. Personal testimonials spread throughout Yarnum and beyond, each story more remarkable than the last, creating a wave of interest that brought ever more people seeking the church's miraculous treatments. The church was careful to document these successes. Detailed records were kept of each patient's condition before treatment, the specific preparation and dosage of blood administered, and the results observed afterward. These records served multiple purposes. They allowed church scholars to refine their techniques. They provided evidence of the treatment's effectiveness, and they created a narrative of success that could be shared with skeptics or potential supporters. Laurence himself took great interest in these records. He would spend hours reviewing treatment outcomes, looking for patterns that might inform improvements to blood ministration protocols. His scholarly training served him well here. He approached the data with rigor and care, always seeking to understand not just what worked, but why it worked. During this period, the church's research into blood ministration expanded in multiple directions. Some scholars focused on developing new preparations for specific conditions. Others investigated ways to enhance the blood's beneficial properties through various processing techniques. Still others studied the mechanism by which the blood produced its effects, seeking to understand the fundamental principles that made such remarkable healing possible. This research led to the development of specialized blood treatments. Blood vials of different types were created, each optimized for particular purposes. There was blood for healing wounds, blood for curing disease, blood for enhancing strength, blood for improving perception and mental acuity. The church's mastery of blood ministration became increasingly sophisticated, allowing them to tailor treatments to individual patients' specific needs. The success of these early years attracted scholars and healers from throughout the region. Many came as skeptics, convinced that the church's claims must be exaggerated or fraudulent. But after witnessing blood ministration's effects firsthand, most became converts, joining the church and contributing their own expertise to its growing body of knowledge. This influx of talent accelerated the church's research and expansion. New facilities were established to house the growing number of scholars and patients. The church's operations became increasingly professionalized, with specialized departments handling different aspects of its mission. What had begun as Laurence's personal project had evolved into a complex institution with hundreds of dedicated members. The church also began to establish satellite facilities beyond Yharnam proper. Smaller clinics were opened in surrounding towns and villages, bringing blood ministration to people who could not travel to the city. These outposts served both humanitarian and strategic purposes. They genuinely helped people in remote areas while also spreading the church's influence and creating networks of loyalty throughout the region. As blood ministration became more widespread, it began to reshape Yharnam society in fundamental ways. The availability of reliable healing reduced fear of injury and disease. People lived longer, healthier lives. The overall vitality of the population increased noticeably. Crime rates dropped as physical ailments that might have driven people to desperation were instead cured through church intervention. The church's success also created new social structures. Those who had received blood ministration often formed communities based on their shared experience. They would gather for regular church services, participate in communal rituals, and support each other through continued treatment. These communities became important sources of social cohesion, giving people a sense of belonging and purpose beyond their individual lives. Laurence watched all of this unfold with deep satisfaction. This was what he had envisioned when he left Byrgenwerth, a practical application of cosmic knowledge that genuinely improved human existence. The abstract philosophizing that Willem favored had been transformed into something concrete, something that touched real lives in meaningful ways. The economic prosperity that accompanied the church's growth seemed to validate Laurence's vision even further. Yharnam was thriving. People were healthier and happier. The city was becoming known throughout the world as a place of healing and hope. Foreign dignitaries came to observe blood ministration techniques. Scholars from distant institutions arrived to study the church's methods. Yharnam was becoming a center of medical innovation and spiritual enlightenment. Yet beneath this surface success, subtle changes were already occurring that would eventually undermine everything Laurence had built. The old blood, for all its remarkable healing properties, was not simply a benign medical tool. It carried within it influences and tendencies that were beginning to manifest in those who received it regularly. Some patients reported dreams that were unusually vivid or disturbing. These dreams often featured cosmic imagery, vast spaces filled with strange geometry, entities that seemed to exist outside normal reality, sensations of falling or dissolving into something larger than individual consciousness. The church's scholars noted these reports but generally dismissed them as psychological reactions to the profound physical changes blood ministration produced. Other patients experienced subtle personality changes. Increased aggression or irritability. Heightened sensory perception that sometimes felt overwhelming. Strange cravings, particularly for meat or blood itself. Enhanced strength that sometimes manifested as difficulty controlling one's own physical power. Again, these changes were documented but regarded as acceptable side effects, minor trade-offs for the tremendous benefits blood ministration provided. What wasn't understood, what couldn't be understood given the church's limited knowledge, was that these side effects were actually symptoms of a deeper transformation. The old blood was not just healing the body. It was fundamentally altering the relationship between those who received it and the cosmic forces that had created it. Each treatment deepened these connections, made them more profound and less reversible. The blood was creating bridges between human consciousness and alien intelligences that existed beyond normal reality. These great ones, as Willem had called them, were beginning to take notice of Yharnam and its transformed inhabitants. Their attention was not malevolent, exactly. They were simply too alien for such human concepts to apply. But their interest would prove catastrophic nonetheless. Physical changes were beginning to manifest as well, though they remained subtle enough to avoid alarming patients or church officials. People who received blood ministration regularly began to show small alterations, slightly sharper teeth, nails that grew more quickly and were harder to trim, subtle changes in facial structure or body proportions. These changes were gradual enough to be rationalized away, attributed to natural variation or improved health rather than fundamental transformation. The church's scholars, including Laurence himself, noticed these phenomena but did not yet recognize them as harbingers of disaster. They were too focused on the obvious benefits, too committed to their vision of blood ministration as purely beneficial. to see the warning signs for what they were. Willem's caution seemed increasingly like paranoia rather than wisdom, his warnings about the old blood appearing more and more unfounded as blood ministration continued to produce remarkable results. This period of early success represents perhaps the most tragic phase of Laurence's story. Everything seemed to be working. His dreams were becoming reality. People were being helped in tangible, meaningful ways. The church was thriving and expanding. From every observable perspective, Laurence's vision was succeeding brilliantly. And yet, forces were already in motion that would eventually consume everything he had built. The very success of blood ministration was ensuring its eventual catastrophic failure. The more people who received the blood, the more connections were formed to cosmic entities beyond human understanding. The more the church expanded, the more thoroughly Yharnam society became dependent on a substance that was slowly, subtly corrupting everyone who touched it. Laurence, brilliant scholar that he was, could not see what was coming. His knowledge, vast as it was, remained fundamentally limited by human perspective. He understood the old blood as a medical tool, a resource to be utilized for human benefit. What he failed to grasp was that the blood was not a passive substance, but rather a conduit for influences that operated according to cosmic logic far beyond human comprehension. The foundation had been laid. The mechanisms of tragedy were engaged. And though the collapse was still years away, it had already become inevitable. Every successful treatment brought the catastrophe closer. Every patient healed was also, unknowingly, being prepared for eventual transformation. The seeds of Yharnam's nightmare had been planted in its moment of greatest hope, but for now, in these golden years of the church's early success, none of this was apparent. The sun shone on Yharnam's streets. The grand cathedral rose toward the sky, and Laurence, the first vicar, stood at the height of his power and influence, believing absolutely that he had proven Willem wrong and charted a better path for humanity's future. As the healing church grew in power and influence, it inevitably encountered challenges that could not be solved through healing and spiritual guidance alone. The old blood, for all its beneficial properties, occasionally produced effects that were problematic. Some individuals who received blood ministration underwent changes that went beyond simple healing. They became stronger, yes, but also more aggressive, more volatile, and in rare cases, genuinely dangerous. Let your eyes grow heavier now as we explore this darker turn. Your body is completely relaxed, sinking deeper into comfort with each breath. The story continues, steady and slow. It was in response to these challenges that Laurence made one of his most consequential decisions, the establishment of the Hunter's Workshop. This institution, while nominally separate from the healing church, was created under Laurence's direct influence and served as the church's martial arm. The workshop would be responsible for dealing with problems that arose from blood ministration, protecting church interests, and exploring the more dangerous applications of their research. During this period, the hunters were generally viewed positively by the people of Yharnam. They were seen as protectors and problem solvers, the church's response to the few negative consequences of an otherwise miraculous medical breakthrough. Their presence was reassuring rather than threatening, evidence that the church took its responsibilities seriously and was prepared to address any issues that might arise. The transformation of the Hunter's Workshop from a small security force into a major institution began with the recruitment of Ludwig. Unlike the workshop's earlier members, Ludwig came to hunting with a unique combination of martial excellence, scholarly background, and genuine spiritual devotion. He was not just effective at his duties, he was inspired by them, seeing his role as a hunter as a sacred calling rather than simply a job. Ludwig's background as a cleric provided him with a perspective that complemented Gehrman's more practical approach. Where the first hunter focused on effectiveness and efficiency, Ludwig emphasized the moral and spiritual dimensions of their work. He developed elaborate philosophies around the hunt, treating it as a form of worship and a means of serving the greater good. This ideological framework proved attractive to many recruits and helped establish hunting as a noble profession rather than a necessary evil. Ludwig spoke of hunters as holy warriors, protectors of the innocent who sacrificed their own safety and even their humanity in service of a greater cause. His sermons and teachings gave hunting a dignity and purpose that transcended mere violence or pest control. Under Ludwig's influence, the Hunter's Workshop began to expand its mission beyond simply dealing with adverse reactions to blood ministration. Hunters started to patrol the streets of Yharnam, maintaining order and providing security for church operations. They investigated reports of unusual activity, protected church officials during their travels, and served as a visible reminder of the church's power and authority. The relationship between Ludwig and Laurence during this period was complex and important. Both men were former Byrgenwerth scholars who had followed different paths in their service to the church. Laurence had focused on administration, theology, and the development of blood ministration techniques. Ludwig had found his calling in the more physical aspects of the church's mission, yet both shared a fundamental belief in the righteousness of their cause and the benefits that the old blood could bring to humanity. Laurence recognized in Ludwig a kindred spirit, someone who combined intellectual rigor with passionate commitment, someone who could articulate a vision that inspired others to greatness. The First Vicar came to rely heavily on Ludwig's judgment and leadership, trusting him with increasingly important responsibilities within the church's operations. Ludwig's ascendancy within the church hierarchy represented the full integration of the Hunter's Workshop into the church's institutional structure. With his appointment to high church office, hunting became not just an auxiliary function, but a central part of the church's identity and mission. The hunters were no longer simply security guards or problem solvers. They were holy warriors, an essential component of the church's divine purpose. The period of Ludwig's leadership was marked by significant expansion in both the church's activities and its territorial reach. No longer content to simply provide healing services to those who sought them out, the church began to actively promote blood ministration throughout Yharnam and beyond. Hunters served as both protectors and evangelists, spreading word of the blood's benefits, while also ensuring that church operations could proceed without interference. This expansion brought the church into contact with various threats and challenges. Other organizations that felt threatened by the church's growing power sometimes attempted to interfere with its operations. Criminal elements sought to exploit or steal the valuable old blood for their own purposes. Foreign powers showed interest in Yharnam's remarkable medical breakthrough and the strategic advantages it might provide. Ludwig's hunters proved more than capable of dealing with these challenges. Their combination of enhanced physical capabilities, thanks to blood ministration, superior equipment, and tactical expertise made them formidable opponents for anyone who opposed the church. More importantly, their reputation for effectiveness served as a deterrent that prevented many potential conflicts from escalating to actual violence. The development of specialized hunter equipment during this period reflected both the practical needs of their missions and the church's growing technical sophistication. Weapons were designed specifically for dealing with individuals who had been transformed by the old blood, incorporating both traditional craftsmanship and innovations based on the church's research. The famous trick weapons that would later become synonymous with Yharnam's hunters evolved during this time. These remarkable implements could transform between different configurations, allowing hunters to adapt to various combat situations. A sword could become a greatsword, a cane could transform into a whip, a hammer could extend into a longer-reaching weapon. These weapons combined versatility with effectiveness in unique ways. Ludwig himself wielded the Holy Moonlight Sword, a weapon of extraordinary power that seemed to channel cosmic forces directly. This blade, which Ludwig claimed had been revealed to him through a divine vision, became a symbol of the church's holy mission and the hunter's sacred calling. The sword's ethereal glow and otherworldly properties seemed to validate Ludwig's theological interpretation of hunting as a form of worship. The Hunter's Workshop also served as a center for research into the military applications of blood ministration. Different blood preparations were tested for their effects on combat performance, healing rates, and physical enhancement. This research, while primarily focused on improving hunter effectiveness, also contributed to the church's broader understanding of the old blood and its potential applications. Ludwig was personally involved in much of this research, volunteering himself as a test subject for new blood preparations and enhancement techniques. His willingness to experiment on himself earned him the respect and loyalty of his hunters, who saw in their leader someone who would never ask them to take risks he wasn't willing to face himself. The blood treatments that Ludwig underwent were more intensive than those administered to ordinary patients. Hunters required greater strength, faster healing, and enhanced sensory perception to effectively perform their duties. This meant they received larger doses of old blood more frequently, and often using more potent preparations than would be safe for civilians. The long-term effects of this intensive blood ministration on hunters were not yet fully apparent during Ludwig's early years, but the seeds of future problems were already being planted. Each treatment strengthened the connection between the hunter and the cosmic forces channeled through the old blood. Each dose brought them closer to the threshold beyond which human consciousness could not be maintained. Ludwig's relationship with his hunters was characterized by mutual respect and shared purpose. He genuinely cared for the welfare of his subordinates and worked hard to ensure they were properly equipped and prepared for their missions. In return, the hunters showed him a devotion that went beyond mere professional loyalty. Many genuinely revered him as a leader and role model, seeing in Ludwig the embodiment of everything a hunter should aspire to be. The church hunter uniform that Ludwig helped design became iconic, black garb that allowed for freedom of movement while providing some protection, adorned with religious symbols that reinforced the hunter's identity as holy warriors. The aesthetic was deliberately chosen to be both practical and intimidating, marking hunters as representatives of the church's authority, while also allowing them to move efficiently through Yharnam's streets and buildings. During this golden age of the hunter's workshop, the relationship between hunters and the general population of Yharnam remained largely positive. Citizens viewed the hunters as protectors and heroes, figures who sacrificed themselves for the common good. The church encouraged this perception through propaganda and public ceremonies that emphasized the noble nature of the hunt and the dedication of those who pursued it. Ludwig himself participated in many of these public events, giving speeches about the hunter's calling and the importance of their work. His eloquence and obvious sincerity made him a popular figure throughout Yharnam. People felt safer knowing that Ludwig and his hunters were watching over them, ready to deal with any threats that might emerge. However, even during this period of success and public acclaim, there were subtle signs of the problems that would later emerge. Some hunters reported experiencing vivid dreams or visions that seemed connected to their consumption of old blood. These dreams often featured the same cosmic imagery that patients occasionally reported: vast spaces, alien geometries, entities that existed beyond normal comprehension. Other hunters described feeling disconnected from their humanity, as if the blood was gradually transforming them into something else. They would catch themselves thinking in ways that seemed foreign, reacting to situations with instincts that felt almost animalistic. Some experienced moments of bloodlust during combat that went beyond normal battle fury, moments when the urge to kill became overwhelming and almost impossible to control. These concerns were generally dismissed as minor side effects of an otherwise beneficial treatment. The church's position was that the enhanced physical and mental capabilities provided by blood ministration necessarily came with some psychological adjustments. Hunters were encouraged to view these changes as part of their transformation into more effective servants of the church's mission. Ludwig himself experienced these effects, but interpreted them through his spiritual framework. The dreams and visions, he believed, were forms of divine communication. The enhanced instincts were gifts that made him a more effective protector. The occasional moments of overwhelming bloodlust were tests of his faith and self-control, opportunities to prove his devotion to the church's ideals. This interpretation, while sincere, represented a dangerous form of denial. Ludwig was reframing symptoms of corruption as signs of divine favor, transforming warning signs into validation. This pattern of interpretation would eventually prove catastrophic, not just for Ludwig personally, but for the entire institution of hunting that he had worked so hard to build and define. The relationship between the healing church and the hunter's workshop during Ludwig's tenure represented the church at its most effective and idealistic. The two institutions worked in harmony, each supporting the other's mission. The church provided spiritual guidance and medical expertise. The workshop provided security and the capacity to deal with problems through direct action. Together, they seemed capable of handling any challenge, solving any problem, overcoming any obstacle. Yet this very effectiveness created its own dangers. The church's success encouraged them to push further in their experiments with the old blood. If hunters could handle the occasional adverse reaction, then perhaps the church could be more aggressive in its blood ministration programs, reaching new populations and trying new techniques. The workshop's ability to contain and eliminate threats gave church leadership a false sense of security, encouraging risks that would eventually prove catastrophic. The period of Ludwig's ascendancy thus represents both the height of the church's power and the beginning of its ultimate corruption. The noble ideals that motivated both Laurence and Ludwig were genuine. Their achievements in reducing suffering and improving human existence were real and substantial. But the very success of their enterprise was laying the groundwork for tragedy on a cosmic scale. Ludwig himself would eventually fall victim to the forces he had dedicated his life to fighting. His transformation from heroic hunter into a monstrous beast would serve as a terrible symbol of how completely the old blood could corrupt even the most noble intentions and the strongest faith. But during these early years, such a fate seemed impossible. Ludwig was the very embodiment of righteous purpose, a warrior scholar who represented the best of what the church hoped to achieve. The hunter's workshop under Ludwig's leadership represented the healing church at its most idealistic and effective. It was an institution that genuinely served to protect people while advancing the church's mission. The hunters of this era were heroes in the truest sense, individuals who risked their lives to make their community safer and better. Yet even this noble institution carried within it the contradictions that would eventually destroy the church itself. The very blood that gave hunters their strength and effectiveness was slowly transforming them into something inhuman. The weapons and techniques they developed to combat the old blood's negative effects would eventually be turned against the church's own members. Most tragically, the success of the workshop encouraged the church to pursue ever more dangerous experiments, ultimately leading to horrors that no amount of hunting skill could contain. As years passed and blood ministration became increasingly common throughout Yharnam, the subtle warnings that Willem had perceived in his early studies of the old blood began to manifest in increasingly obvious and disturbing ways. Let your breathing deepen now as we explore this darker chapter. Feel yourself becoming heavier, more relaxed, as the story unfolds. What had started as rare, isolated incidents of adverse reactions gradually evolved into a pattern of transformation that would ultimately threaten the very foundation of the civilization Laurence had worked so hard to build. The first signs of what would later be called the scourge of the beast were easy to dismiss as isolated medical anomalies. Patients who had undergone extensive blood ministration sometimes reported strange dreams, unusual cravings, or temporary changes in behavior. These symptoms were generally mild and seemed to resolve themselves over time, leading church doctors to classify them as minor side effects of an otherwise beneficial treatment. After all, every medical intervention carried some risk of side effects. The important thing was that the benefits far outweighed these minor inconveniences. However, more careful observation revealed that these seemingly harmless symptoms were often precursors to more dramatic changes. Patients who had initially shown only mild behavioral alterations sometimes progressed to more severe transformations. Physical changes began to accompany the mental ones: increased hair growth, particularly on the face and arms, dental modifications, with teeth becoming sharper and more prominent, alterations in posture and gait that suggested fundamental changes in skeletal and muscular structure. The church's initial response to these developments was to intensify their research into blood preparation and administration techniques. Scholars theorized that the unwanted transformations were the result of improper dosages, contaminated blood samples, or individual genetic predispositions that could be identified and avoided through better screening. They developed more sophisticated procedures for vetting potential patients, looking for factors that might predispose individuals to transformation. They refined their blood preparation methods, attempting to isolate the beneficial properties while eliminating whatever components might be causing the adverse reactions. New protocols were established for monitoring patients after treatment, with regular follow-up examinations designed to catch problems early. For a time, these measures seemed effective. The rate of obvious transformations decreased, and the Church was able to point to improved safety records as evidence that they had solved the problem. Church officials reassured nervous citizens that blood ministration was safe when properly administered, that the early problems had been growing pains that had now been overcome through scientific rigor and careful methodology. However, what they had actually accomplished was simply to slow down and disguise the transformation process rather than eliminate it entirely. The old blood's influence was now working more subtly, creating changes that were less immediately obvious, but potentially more dangerous in the long term. The transformations that had once occurred over weeks now took months or even years to manifest fully, making it difficult to connect them directly to blood ministration and allowing the Church to maintain plausible deniability about the treatment's role in creating beasts. The true nature of the beast scourge began to become apparent as transformed individuals' conditions progressed beyond these initial stages. What had seemed like manageable behavioral changes gradually escalated into genuine loss of human consciousness and identity. Patients who had appeared to be recovering would suddenly undergo rapid physical and mental transformations that left them as something fundamentally different from human beings. These transformed individuals, the first true beasts, retained little of their former personalities or memories. They were driven by primal instincts and urges that made them dangerous to themselves and others. Most significantly, they seemed driven by an insatiable hunger for blood, particularly blood from humans who had undergone ministration themselves. This cannibalistic behavior created a feedback loop that accelerated the spread of the transformation. Beasts would attack humans, often consuming their blood or flesh. This contact with beast fluids could sometimes trigger or accelerate transformation in the victim, even if they survived the initial attack. The scourge began to spread, not just through blood ministration, but through direct transmission from beast to human. The Church's response to these developments revealed both their adaptability and their fundamental misunderstanding of what they were dealing with. Rather than questioning the basic premises of blood ministration, Church leaders focused on containment and management strategies. They developed protocols for identifying individuals who were beginning to transform, procedures for isolating them from the general population, and techniques for either reversing the transformation or eliminating the threat they posed. This is where the Hunter's Workshop found itself at the center of the Church's containment efforts. What had originally been conceived as a research and security organization was rapidly transformed into something more akin to a specialized military force dedicated to combating the beast threat. Hunters developed new weapons and tactics specifically designed for dealing with transformed humans, and their role in Church operations became increasingly central. The weapons developed during this period reflected the unique challenges posed by the beast scourge. Traditional weapons proved inadequate against creatures that possessed enhanced strength, speed, and resilience as a result of their transformation. The trick weapons of Yharnam's hunters evolved in response to these challenges, incorporating mechanisms that allowed for rapid adaptation to different combat situations and specialized features designed to exploit weaknesses in beast physiology. The development of serrated weapons represented a particularly important innovation in anti-beast warfare. Church researchers discovered that certain types of cutting implements were particularly effective against transformed individuals, apparently causing more damage than would be expected from their physical characteristics alone. This discovery led to the incorporation of serrated edges into many hunter weapons and contributed to the development of specialized anti-beast ammunition and tools. Fire-based weapons and tools also proved unusually effective against beasts. The Church's scholars theorized that the transformations somehow made affected individuals particularly vulnerable to flame, though the exact mechanism remained unclear. This discovery led to the development of Molotov cocktails, oil urns, and other incendiary devices that became standard equipment for hunters dealing with beast threats. The relationship between blood ministration and beast transformation created a terrible paradox for the Church. The very treatment that had made their organization successful and powerful was also the source of their greatest threat. Discontinuing blood ministration entirely would eliminate the beast scourge, but it would also destroy the church's primary claim to relevance and authority. The solution they pursued was to continue blood ministration, while attempting to manage its negative consequences through hunter intervention. This approach required an increasingly complex and sophisticated infrastructure. The church developed systems for monitoring blood ministration recipients for signs of transformation, networks of informants who could report unusual behavior in the community, and rapid response teams that could intervene when transformations occurred. The bureaucracy required to support these activities grew exponentially, transforming the church from a relatively simple religious organization into a complex administrative and military apparatus. New departments were created to handle different aspects of the beast scourge problem. Record keeping became increasingly important as the church attempted to track which patients were at risk and what factors might predict transformation. The psychological impact of the beast scourge on Yharnam's population was profound and lasting. The knowledge that anyone who had undergone blood ministration might potentially transform into a monster created an atmosphere of suspicion and fear that permeated every aspect of daily life. Families were torn apart by accusations and suspicions. Communities divided by the need to constantly monitor each other for signs of transformation. Neighbors who had lived peacefully together for years suddenly found themselves viewing each other with suspicion. A person who seemed irritable might be in the early stages of transformation. Someone who displayed unusual physical strength could be turning into a beast. Even children were not exempt from suspicion. The church's records showed that transformation could occur at any age, making every member of society a potential threat. The church attempted to manage this psychological crisis through a combination of propaganda and religious doctrine. They developed theological explanations for the beast scourge that positioned it as a test of faith or a consequence of insufficient devotion to church teachings. Those who transformed, according to this doctrine, had failed to maintain proper spiritual discipline or had allowed themselves to be corrupted by sinful thoughts and behaviors. These explanations served to deflect blame from blood ministration itself, while providing a framework for understanding and coping with the ongoing crisis. They also had the effect of making transformation seem like a moral failure rather than a medical problem, which helped maintain public support for blood ministration, even as its dangers became increasingly obvious. The concept of the hunt emerged during this period as both a practical necessity and a spiritual ritual. The church promoted the idea that hunting beasts was not merely a matter of public safety, but a sacred duty that brought participants closer to divine truth. This religious framework helped to recruit and motivate hunters, while also providing a way for ordinary citizens to participate in combating the scourge through support and cooperation. The nighttime hunts that would later become synonymous with Yharnam began as emergency responses to beast sightings, but they gradually evolved into regular, organized events. The church established protocols for declaring a hunt, mobilizing hunters and civilian volunteers, and coordinating search and elimination efforts. These hunts served multiple purposes. They provided an outlet for community fear and anger, allowing citizens to feel they were actively fighting back against the threat, rather than simply cowering in their homes. They demonstrated the church's continued ability to protect the population, maintaining confidence in the institution, even as the problems it had created spiraled out of control. And they created opportunities for the church to identify and eliminate potential threats before they fully manifested. However, the psychological toll of participating in these hunts was significant. Hunters were required to kill creatures that had once been human, often individuals they had known personally. The trauma of this experience, combined with the effects of the blood ministration that hunters received to enhance their capabilities, created additional risks for mental instability and eventual transformation. Many hunters found themselves caught in a horrible paradox. The blood they consumed to fight beasts was the same substance that had created those beasts in the first place. Each dose brought them closer to the fate of those they hunted. The line between hunter and hunted became increasingly blurred, until it was sometimes difficult to tell which was which. The church's attempts to manage the beast scourge also led to increasingly aggressive research into its underlying causes and potential solutions. Scientists and scholars within the church hierarchy pursued various theories about the nature of the old blood and its effects on human physiology. Some focused on genetic factors that might predispose individuals to transformation. Others investigated environmental conditions that might trigger or accelerate the process. One particularly significant area of research involved attempts to identify individuals who seemed naturally resistant to transformation. These rare individuals, who could undergo extensive blood ministration without showing obvious signs of beastly changes, were studied intensively in hopes of understanding what protected them and whether their resistance could be transferred to others. The Church also began to explore more radical approaches to managing the scourge, including attempts to control or direct the transformation process rather than simply preventing it. Some researchers theorized that if the beast transformation could be understood and guided, it might be possible to create controlled versions that retained human intelligence while gaining enhanced physical capabilities. These experiments represented a significant escalation in the Church's research activities and marked a departure from Laurence's original vision of using the old blood purely for healing. The pressure to find solutions to the beast scourge was driving the Church toward increasingly desperate and dangerous research projects that would have profound implications for the future. The beast scourge also had significant economic and social effects on Yharnam. The uncertainty about who might transform and when created disruptions in commerce, industry, and social relationships. Businesses struggled to maintain operations when employees might suddenly transform into monsters. Trade routes became dangerous as the scourge spread beyond the city itself. The resources required to support the hunter's workshop and the various containment efforts placed increasing strain on the Church's finances and diverted attention from other activities. International relationships were also affected as word of Yharnam's problems spread to other regions. Foreign governments and institutions became increasingly wary of contact with the city, fearing that the beast scourge might spread beyond its borders. This isolation further increased the pressure on the Church to find solutions to their crisis, while also limiting their access to external resources and expertise that might have helped. The personal toll on Laurence during this period must have been enormous. The man who had left Byrgenwerth with such confidence in his ability to harness the old blood for human benefit was now forced to confront the reality that his greatest achievement had also created his greatest threat. The beast scourge represented a direct challenge to everything he had worked to build, and its persistence despite the Church's best efforts must have been deeply demoralizing. The irony of Laurence's situation was particularly bitter given his original disagreement with Willem. His former master's warnings about the dangers of the old blood were proving prophetic in the most devastating way possible. Yet by this point, the Church had become so dependent on blood ministration, so thoroughly integrated into Yharnam's social and economic fabric, that abandoning it seemed impossible even if Laurence had been willing to admit that Willem had been correct. The beast scourge represented the beginning of the end for Laurence's vision of human improvement through blood ministration. While the Church would continue to operate and even expand its activities for some time to come, the fundamental premise that had driven its creation, that the old blood could be safely used to benefit humanity, had been definitively disproven. The challenge now was to manage the consequences of this realization while attempting to maintain the Church's authority and relevance in a world that was rapidly becoming more dangerous and chaotic. As the scourge intensified, Yharnam began to change in fundamental ways. The streets that had once been filled with healthy, vibrant citizens going about their daily lives became places of fear and danger. People ventured out only when necessary, and always with weapons close at hand. The night, which had traditionally been a time of rest and community, became something to be feared and endured behind locked doors and shuttered windows. The Church's response to this transformation of urban life was to establish the formal hunt nights. These organized events, declared by church bells that rang out across the city, signaled that a hunt was underway and that all citizens should retreat to their homes for safety. During hunt nights, the streets belonged to the hunters and the beasts, and ordinary people who ventured outside did so at their own peril. This ritualization of violence and fear became a defining characteristic of Yharnam life. The sound of hunt bells became one of the most recognizable and dreaded sounds in the city, a signal that death was coming for someone or something, that blood would flow through the streets before dawn. Citizens developed elaborate preparations for hunt nights, securing their homes, checking their weapons, and often praying to the church's theology for protection. The beast scourge also transformed the physical landscape of Yharnam. Buildings were modified to be more defensible, with reinforced doors and windows that could be barricaded. Secret passages were built to allow escape or movement during hunt nights. Entire districts were sometimes abandoned when the concentration of beasts became too great to control, their streets left to the monsters that had once been their inhabitants. Old Yharnam, in particular, became a cautionary tale of what happened when the scourge could not be contained. An entire district of the city was eventually burned and sealed off, its remaining inhabitants, both human and beast, left to whatever fate awaited them behind massive gates that were never meant to be opened again. This drastic action sent a clear message about the church's priorities. When necessary, they would sacrifice entire communities to protect the church's interests and maintain the illusion of control. The psychological toll of living in this transformed Yharnam cannot be overstated. Every citizen carried the knowledge that they or their loved ones might be the next to transform. Every strange behavior or physical change had to be reported and investigated. Trust, that fundamental building block of community, had been corroded by fear and necessity until it was almost impossible to maintain genuine human connections. Deep in the hunter's nightmare, where blood-drunk hunters are condemned to wander for eternity, lies a secret that cuts to the very heart of Laurence's legacy and the healing church's darkest chapter. Let yourself continue to relax as we explore this tragic tale. Your body is heavy, your mind is quiet, and the story flows like a gentle river. The Fishing Hamlet represents not just a location, but a testament to how far the church had fallen from its original ideals of healing and human betterment. In this remote coastal village, the church's quest for knowledge and power led to atrocities that would ultimately damn not just the perpetrators, but generations of hunters to come. The hamlet itself was once a simple fishing community, remote and isolated from the political machinations of Yharnam. Its inhabitants lived simple lives sustained by the sea, largely unaware of the cosmic forces that would eventually engulf their world. The village's fate was sealed when the corpse of a great one, known as Kos, washed ashore on their beach, an event that would transform both the villagers and the course of history itself. Kos, even in death, carried within her body parasites and influences that began to affect the hamlet's residents in profound ways. These changes were not the violent transformations that characterized the beast scourge in Yharnam, but rather a more gradual evolution that seemed to bring the villagers closer to their oceanic environment. As your will was, what we would do is, but durasha, what we view our face, we're closer to their oceanic environment. They developed fish-like characteristics, gained new forms of perception, and began to worship the deceased Great One as a benevolent deity. The discovery of Kos's corpse and the transformed villagers presented an unprecedented opportunity for the scholars of Byrgenwerth and the healing church. Here was a chance to study the effects of direct contact with a Great One, to understand the mechanisms of transformation at their source, and potentially to harness these forces for the benefit of humanity. The potential for advancing their understanding of cosmic truth and human evolution seemed limitless. However, the approach taken by the church and its associated scholars revealed how completely they had abandoned the ethical constraints that had once guided their research. Rather than attempting to communicate with the transformed villagers or study them in their natural environment, the researchers chose to treat them as specimens to be collected and analyzed. The hamlet's residents, despite their obvious intelligence and capacity for suffering, were viewed as valuable research materials rather than sentient beings deserving of respect and consideration. The expedition to the Fishing Hamlet included some of the most prominent figures in the church's hierarchy. Lady Maria, one of Gehrman's most accomplished students and a hunter of exceptional skill and dedication, was among those who participated in what would become known as the Hamlet's destruction. Her presence in the expedition speaks to how the church's most noble and idealistic members were drawn into participating in actions that contradicted their fundamental values. Gehrman himself, the first hunter and architect of the Hunter's Workshop, played a crucial role in the Hamlet's fate. His participation in the expedition demonstrates how completely the church's mission had shifted from protection and healing to exploitation and violence. The man who had once been Laurence's ally in the noble work of establishing the workshop was now leading raids against innocent communities in pursuit of research materials. The methods employed by the church's expedition to the hamlet were brutal and systematic. Villagers were killed not in battle or self-defense, but as part of deliberate efforts to harvest their transformed bodies for study. Skulls were cracked open to examine the development of eyes on the inside, the enhanced perception that Willem had theorized was necessary for human evolution. Bodies were dissected and analyzed to understand the mechanisms of transformation that Kos's influence had triggered. Most horrifically, the expedition interfered with Kos herself, preventing the birth of her child and violating the corpse of the Great One in ways that would have cosmic consequences. The orphan of Kos, trapped in a state between life and death by the church's interference, became a focal point for the rage and sorrow of both the Great One and the slaughtered villagers. The immediate justification for these actions was research. The church's scholars convinced themselves that the knowledge gained from studying the hamlet's residents would ultimately benefit all of humanity. They argued that the suffering inflicted on a small community was acceptable if it led to discoveries that could alleviate suffering on a much larger scale. This utilitarian calculus allowed them to rationalize actions that they would never have contemplated in their earlier, more idealistic days. But the deeper motivation was the church's growing desperation in the face of the beast scourge and other challenges to their authority. The organization that Laurence had founded as a force for healing and human improvement was struggling to maintain its relevance and power in the face of mounting evidence that their central premise had been flawed from the beginning. The hamlet represented an opportunity to find new sources of knowledge and power that might allow them to overcome their current difficulties. The psychological impact of participating in the hamlet's destruction was devastating for many of the church's members. Lady Maria, despite her exceptional skills and dedication to the hunter's calling, was so traumatized by her participation that she threw away her beloved weapon and swore off hunting entirely. As subsequent work, caring for patients in the research hall represented an attempt to atone for her actions, but the guilt and horror of what she had done ultimately drove her to take her own life. The transformation of the church's most noble members into participants in genocide represents one of the most tragic aspects of Laurence's legacy. These were individuals who had genuinely believed in the church's mission and had dedicated their lives to protecting and serving others. Yet the institutional pressures and ideological commitments that the church had developed over time led them to participate in actions that violated their most fundamental values. The cosmic consequences of the hamlet's destruction extended far beyond the immediate victims. Kos, despite her death, retained consciousness on a level that transcended physical existence. The Great One's grief and rage at the violation of her child and the slaughter of her worshippers created a curse that would affect all hunters, not just those who had directly participated in the atrocity. This curse manifested as the hunter's nightmare, a realm where blood-drunk hunters are condemned to hunt eternally without rest or release. The nightmare serves as both punishment and prison, trapping those who had given in to the intoxicating effects of blood ministration and the violence that it promoted. The existence of this realm represents a cosmic form of justice that operates beyond human understanding or control. The creation of the hunter's nightmare also demonstrates the interconnected nature of the cosmic forces that the church had been attempting to manipulate. Actions taken in the physical world had consequences that extended into realms of existence that the church's scholars barely understood. Their attempts to exploit cosmic forces for their own purposes had triggered responses that they were completely unprepared to handle. For Laurence personally, the hamlet's destruction represented the complete corruption of his original vision. The man who had left Byrgenwerth with dreams of using the old blood to heal and improve humanity had become complicit in genocide committed in the name of research and power. The noble ideals that had motivated his split from Willem had been perverted into justifications for unspeakable cruelty. The church's attempts to cover up and forget the hamlet's destruction reveal their awareness that their actions could not be justified by their stated values. Rather than acknowledging what they had done and attempting to make amends, church leaders chose to suppress knowledge of the expedition and eliminate anyone who might reveal the truth about their actions. This cover-up represents a final abandonment of the transparency and accountability that any ethical institution requires. The presence of figures like Brador, the church assassin, in the hunter's nightmare demonstrates the lengths to which the church was willing to go to protect its secrets. Even in death and damnation, the church's agents continued to work to prevent the truth about the hamlet from being revealed. This obsessive secrecy suggests a deep awareness of guilt and an understanding that their actions had been fundamentally wrong. The fish-like villagers who survived the initial slaughter were condemned to an existence in the nightmare realm, forever mourning their dead and cursing those who had destroyed their community. Their continued presence serves as a constant reminder of the church's crimes and ensures that the memory of what happened cannot be completely erased. The priest who wanders the hamlet, cursing Byrgenwerth and calling for vengeance, gives voice to the pain and anger of all the victims. The hamlet's destruction also represents a broader pattern of exploitation and violence that had come to characterize the church's operations. What began as isolated incidents of research overreach had evolved into systematic campaigns of violence against anyone who possessed knowledge or characteristics that the church wanted to study. The hamlet was simply the most extreme example of a mentality that viewed other beings as expendable resources rather than entities deserving of moral consideration. The knowledge gained from the hamlet's destruction proved to be of limited value in solving the church's fundamental problems. Despite all the suffering inflicted and the cosmic consequences triggered, the research conducted on the villagers' transformed bodies did not provide the breakthroughs that the church had hoped for. The beast scourge continued to plague Yharnam. The old blood remained dangerous and unpredictable, and the church's authority continued to decline. This failure of the church's research to produce meaningful benefits makes the hamlet's destruction even more tragic. Lives were destroyed and cosmic forces unleashed not in pursuit of genuinely beneficial knowledge, but in service of an institution's desperate attempt to maintain its relevance and power. The utilitarian justifications that the church had used to rationalize their actions were revealed to be hollow when the promised benefits failed to materialize. The Hamlet story also illustrates the dangers of institutional momentum and ideological commitment. Once the church had committed itself to certain approaches and assumptions, it became increasingly difficult for its members to question or abandon these commitments, even when they led to obviously harmful outcomes. The institution's need to justify its past actions created pressure to continue down the same path regardless of the moral cost. For the hunters who participated in the hamlet's destruction, the experience represented a fundamental betrayal of everything they had been taught to believe about their calling. They had been told that hunting was a noble profession dedicated to protecting innocent people from the dangers posed by the beast scourge. Yet in the hamlet, they found themselves killing innocent people in service of their institution's research agenda. This betrayal of their fundamental values helps explain why so many of the hunters who participated in the expedition eventually succumbed to blood drunkenness and were condemned to the hunter's nightmare. The psychological trauma of participating in genocide, combined with the increasing doses of old blood required to maintain their enhanced capabilities, created a perfect storm of factors that led to their corruption and downfall. The Fishing Hamlet stands as perhaps the darkest chapter in the Healing Church's history, but it was not an aberration or deviation from the Church's normal operations. Instead, it represented the logical endpoint of the institution's gradual transformation from a healing organization into an exploitative research apparatus. The same mentality that allowed church scholars to justify experimentation on unwilling subjects in their laboratories made it possible for them to justify genocide when the potential research benefits were large enough. Understanding the Hamlet's fate is crucial to understanding Laurence's ultimate transformation and damnation. While he may not have personally participated in the expedition, his role as the church's founder and leader made him morally responsible for the actions taken in the institution's name. The curse that Kos placed on the hunters extended to all those who had enabled and benefited from the church's crimes, including its founder. The Fishing Hamlet thus serves as both a literal location in the hunter's nightmare and a metaphorical representation of how completely Laurence's noble vision had been corrupted. What began as a dream of using cosmic forces to heal and improve humanity had become a nightmare of exploitation, violence, and cosmic horror that would ultimately consume not just its victims, but its perpetrators as well. The transformation of Laurence from revered First Vicar into the first of the terrible Cleric Beasts represents the ultimate irony of his story. Let your eyelids grow even heavier now as we explore this final chapter of Laurence's human existence. Your body is completely relaxed, sinking deeper into comfort with each passing moment. The man who had dedicated his life to healing and human improvement became the very embodiment of the corruption he had unleashed upon the world. This metamorphosis was not sudden or unexpected, but rather the inevitable culmination of years of exposure to the old blood and the psychological weight of the horrors committed in his name. By the time Laurence underwent his final transformation, the healing church had already begun to fracture under the weight of its own contradictions. The beast scourge continued to spread despite all efforts to contain it. The hunter's workshop, once the church's proud martial arm, was increasingly staffed by individuals who struggled with their own blood-driven madness. The atrocities committed at the Fishing Hamlet had created cosmic enemies that threatened the very existence of the church's operations. Laurence himself had been consuming the old blood for years, both as part of his research into its properties and as a means of maintaining the enhanced vitality necessary for his demanding role as church leader. Like many of the church's elite, he had convinced himself that his superior knowledge and spiritual preparation would protect him from the negative effects that afflicted ordinary recipients of blood ministration. This hubris would prove to be his ultimate downfall. The first signs of Laurence's transformation were subtle and easily dismissed. Enhanced physical strength and vitality were expected effects of blood ministration, and the first vicar's increased capabilities were viewed as benefits rather than warning signs. Slight changes in temperament, increased aggression, reduced empathy, growing disconnection from human concerns, were rationalized as necessary adaptations to the church's increasingly dangerous environment. More concerning were the psychological changes that Laurence experienced as his transformation progressed. His once idealistic vision of human improvement through blood ministration began to evolve into something darker and more primal. Where he had once seen the old blood as a tool for healing, he increasingly viewed it as an end in itself, a source of power and transformation that justified any sacrifice or corruption necessary to obtain it. The irony of Laurence's situation was that his deep knowledge of the old blood and its effects made him acutely aware of what was happening to him, even as he proved powerless to prevent it. Unlike ordinary victims of the beast scourge, who often underwent their transformations in ignorance of what was occurring, Laurence watched his own corruption with the clinical detachment of a scholar, observing an experimental subject. This awareness only added to the psychological torment of his condition. Laurence was forced to witness the gradual erosion of his humanity, while retaining enough of his original personality to understand the full implications of what he was becoming. The man who had once promised Willem that he would remember the adage to fear the old blood was now living proof of what happened when that fear was overcome by ambition and necessity. The physical aspects of Laurence's transformation followed the pattern that had been observed in other cleric beasts, but with unique characteristics that reflected his particular relationship to the old blood and the cosmic forces it channeled. His body grew larger and more powerful, developing the bestial characteristics that marked all victims of advanced beast scourge. However, his transformation was accompanied by an internal fire that distinguished him from other transformed individuals. This flame that burned within Laurence was not merely a physical phenomenon, but a manifestation of the spiritual and cosmic forces that had shaped his life and work. The fire represented both his original passion for healing and improvement, and the corruption of that passion into something destructive and consuming. It was a fitting symbol for a man whose greatest virtues had become the source of his ultimate damnation. The passion that had driven him to leave Byrgenwerth, the conviction that had allowed him to build the healing church, the dedication that had made him work tirelessly for human betterment. All of these noble qualities had been transformed by the old blood into fuel for his transformation and eternal suffering. The process of Laurence's transformation was accelerated by the psychological trauma of witnessing the collapse of everything he had worked to build. The healing church, despite its continued political power, had failed in its fundamental mission of improving human existence through blood ministration. Instead of creating a better world, Laurence's innovations had unleashed horrors that threatened to consume all of civilization. The knowledge that his life's work had been fundamentally flawed must have been devastating for a man of Laurence's intelligence and dedication. The realization that Willem had been correct about the dangers of the old blood, and that his own stubborn refusal to heed those warnings had led to countless deaths and transformations, created a level of guilt and despair that accelerated his physical and mental deterioration. As Laurence's transformation progressed, he began to lose his ability to communicate with other humans, though he retained enough awareness to understand what was happening around him. This partial consciousness made his condition particularly tragic. He was trapped within a bestial form, unable to express his thoughts or feelings, yet still capable of experiencing the full horror of his situation. The Church's response to their founder's transformation revealed the institution's complete abandonment of its original values. Rather than attempting to help Laurence, or at least allow him to die with dignity, Church leaders made the calculated decision to eliminate him as a threat to their operations. The man who had created their organization and led it to unprecedented power was killed by the very hunters he had helped to establish. The method of Laurence's death was particularly significant given his lifelong work with healing and the old blood. The Church's hunters used fire to kill him, recognizing that the beast scourge was vulnerable to flame in ways that ordinary humans were not. This use of fire to destroy a beast represented the ultimate irony of Laurence's story. The healing properties of the old blood that he had championed were ultimately overcome by one of humanity's oldest and most primitive tools. However, death did not bring Laurence the release that it might have provided to an ordinary individual. His deep connection to the old blood and the cosmic forces it channeled ensured that his consciousness persisted beyond physical death. Moreover, his role in the atrocities committed by the healing Church, particularly the destruction of the Fishing Hamlet, made him subject to the same cosmic curse that affected all the Church's blood-drunk agents. The curse placed by Kos ensured that Laurence would not find peace in death, but would instead be condemned to exist in the hunter's nightmare for eternity. In this realm of punishment and torment, he was doomed to burn forever. The internal fire that had characterized his transformation now served as a source of endless suffering rather than power or illumination. The version of Laurence that exists in the hunter's nightmare is a tragic figure who embodies all the contradictions and failures of the healing Church's mission. He retains enough of his original consciousness to suffer from the knowledge of what he has become and what his actions have wrought. Yet he is trapped in a bestial form that prevents him from communicating or acting on that knowledge. The flames that surround Laurence in the nightmare serve multiple symbolic functions. They represent the passion and idealism that had originally motivated his work, now corrupted into a source of endless torment. They symbolize the destructive consequences of his actions, which continue to burn long after his physical death. Most importantly, they serve as a reminder of the cosmic justice that operates beyond human understanding or control. The altar where Laurence's skull is displayed in the Grand Cathedral represents the ultimate perversion of his legacy. The Church that he founded chose to venerate his physical remains, while completely ignoring the lessons that his transformation should have taught them. Instead of learning from his fate and abandoning the dangerous practices that had led to his corruption, subsequent Church leaders continued down the same path that had destroyed their founder. The reverence shown for Laurence's skull by figures like Vicar Amelia demonstrates how completely the Church had lost sight of its original mission. Instead of serving as a warning about the dangers of the old blood, Laurence's remains were treated as sacred relics that somehow blessed and legitimized the continued use of blood ministration. This perversion of his memory ensured that his mistakes would be repeated rather than learned from. The fact that Laurence's true skull exists only within the hunter's nightmare, while a false relic is venerated in the physical world, serves as a metaphor for the gap between reality and the Church's propaganda. The institution that claimed to follow his teachings had created a false version of his legacy that served their political needs while ignoring the tragic truth of his actual fate. For those who encounter Laurence in the hunter's nightmare, his presence serves as both a warning and a test. The First Vicar's transformation demonstrates the ultimate consequences of pursuing power and knowledge without adequate consideration for moral and cosmic boundaries. His eternal suffering illustrates the price that must be paid for actions that violate the fundamental order of existence. Yet Laurence's story is not simply one of condemnation and punishment. His original motivations, the desire to heal suffering, improve human existence, and transcend the limitations of mortality, were genuinely noble. The tragedy of his fate lies not in evil intentions, but in the corruption of good intentions by forces beyond human understanding or control. The transformation of Laurence from idealistic scholar to monstrous beast to eternally burning phantom represents a complete cycle of human ambition and cosmic justice. His story serves as a cautionary tale about the dangers of pursuing knowledge and power without adequate humility or respect for the forces being manipulated. It demonstrates how even the most noble intentions can be corrupted when they encounter cosmic truths that transcend human comprehension. Understanding Laurence's transformation is crucial to understanding the broader themes of Bloodborne's narrative. His fate illustrates the cosmic horror that emerges when humans attempt to transcend their natural limitations through contact with alien forces. The old blood that promised healing and improvement ultimately delivered corruption and transformation, not because it was inherently evil, but because it represented power that humans were not equipped to safely handle. The Hunter's Nightmare stands as perhaps the most profound manifestation of cosmic justice in the world of Bloodborne. Let yourself drift even deeper now as we explore this realm of eternal punishment. Your breathing is slow and steady. Your body is heavy and relaxed. The story continues to unfold like a dream, a realm where the consequences of the healing church's crimes are made manifest in the form of eternal punishment for those who participated in or enabled their atrocities. This nightmarish dimension serves not merely as a prison, but as a carefully constructed form of poetic justice that reflects the specific nature of each prisoner's crimes and ensures that their suffering continues indefinitely. The creation of the Hunter's Nightmare was not the result of human action or design, but rather emerged from the grief and rage of Kos, the Great One whose corpse had washed ashore at the Fishing Hamlet. The violation of her body and the slaughter of her worshippers had created a wound in the cosmic order that demanded redress. The nightmare realm that emerged from this cosmic trauma was both punishment and prison, designed to contain and torment those responsible for the Hamlet's destruction. The nature of the nightmare itself reflects the twisted logic of cosmic justice. Rather than simply subjecting its prisoners to arbitrary suffering, the realm forces them to experience eternal versions of the very activities that had led to their damnation. Blood-drunk hunters are condemned to hunt forever, never finding the satisfaction or resolution that they had sought in life. The violence that had once provided them with purpose and meaning becomes a source of endless frustration and despair. For Laurence, the nightmare's punishment is particularly fitting given his role as the architect of the healing church's corruption. The man who had once preached about the divine nature of the old blood and its capacity to heal and improve humanity is now trapped in a form that represents the ultimate perversion of those ideals. His eternal burning serves as a constant reminder of the destructive consequences of his ambitions and the cosmic forces he had attempted to control. The environment of the Hunter's Nightmare itself serves as a twisted mirror of the world that Laurence and his contemporaries had created. The cathedral where his burning form rests is a grotesque parody of the grand cathedral he had built in Yharnam, complete with the same architectural elements but perverted into something nightmarish and oppressive. The altar where he lies burning is positioned in the same location where his skull would later be venerated, creating a connection between his eternal suffering and the false worship that his legacy would inspire. The presence of other significant figures from the church's history within the nightmare demonstrates the comprehensive nature of cosmic justice. Lady Maria, despite her eventual rejection of hunting and her attempts to atone for her participation in the Hamlet's destruction, remains trapped in the nightmare as guardian of its deepest secrets. Her role as protector of the research hall and the path to the Fishing Hamlet reflects her continued complicity in the church's crimes, even after her death. Ludwig, the once noble first church hunter, has been transformed into a grotesque beast that embodies the corruption of his idealistic vision of hunting as a sacred calling. His presence in the nightmare serves as a reminder that even the most sincere and dedicated servants of the church, were ultimately corrupted by the institution's fundamental flaws. The hunter who had once inspired others with his noble vision of their calling has become a mindless monster driven by bloodlust and violence. The landscape of the hunter's nightmare itself tells the story of the church's crimes and their consequences. The twisted version of Cathedral Ward that forms the nightmare's first area is populated by blood-drunk hunters who endlessly patrol and fight, never finding the resolution or purpose they seek. These figures represent the ultimate fate of all those who had embraced the church's vision of hunting as a solution to the problems created by blood ministration. The research hall, with its grotesque experiments and suffering patients, serves as a monument to the church's abandonment of medical ethics in pursuit of knowledge and power. The patients who wander the hall's corridors in various states of transformation and madness represent the countless victims of the church's research programs. Their presence in the nightmare ensures that the memory of their suffering is preserved and that those responsible cannot escape the consequences of their actions. The Fishing Hamlet itself, preserved within the nightmare in the state it existed at the time of its destruction, serves as the ultimate testimony to the church's crimes. The village remains frozen at the moment of its violation, with the bodies of its slaughtered inhabitants still visible and the signs of the violence committed against them permanently preserved. This preservation ensures that the truth of what happened cannot be forgotten or denied, even by those who would prefer to bury the evidence of their guilt. The relationship between the nightmare and the physical world reflects the cosmic nature of the justice being dispensed. Actions taken in the material realm have consequences that extend into dimensions beyond normal human perception or understanding. The church's attempts to hide or minimize their crimes in the physical world are rendered meaningless by the nightmare's preservation of the truth and its eternal punishment of the guilty. For Laurence specifically, the nightmare represents the complete failure of his life's work and the ultimate vindication of Willem's warnings. The man who had left Byrgenwerth convinced that he could safely harness the power of the old blood is now trapped in a realm created by the very cosmic forces he had thought he could control. His eternal burning serves as a testament to the hubris that had driven his rejection of his master's caution and wisdom. The fact that Laurence retains some level of consciousness within his burning form makes his punishment particularly cruel and meaningful. Unlike a simple death, which might have provided release from guilt and suffering, his condition in the nightmare forces him to remain aware of what he has become and what his actions have wrought. He is compelled to experience eternal suffering while retaining enough of his original personality to fully understand the justice of his fate. The flames that consume Laurence in the nightmare are not merely physical, but represent the spiritual and emotional torment that results from complete moral failure. The fire that burns within him is fueled by his knowledge of the suffering he has caused, the lives he has destroyed, and the noble ideals he has corrupted. Each moment of his existence serves as a reminder of the gap between his original intentions and his ultimate achievements. The nightmare's treatment of Laurence also serves to illustrate the cosmic perspective on human ambition and achievement. From a cosmic viewpoint, the distinctions between noble intentions and evil actions become irrelevant when the consequences are equally destructive. Laurence's genuine desire to help humanity is meaningless in the face of the actual harm his actions caused, and the nightmare's justice operates according to results rather than intentions. The presence of the orphan of Kos at the heart of the nightmare represents the focal point of the cosmic rage that created this realm of punishment. The child that was prevented from being born naturally has become a manifestation of pure cosmic fury, embodying the violation that was committed against both Kos and the natural order itself. The orphan's existence ensures that the nightmare will continue to function as long as the injustice it represents remains unaddressed. The relationship between the orphan and the other inhabitants of the nightmare reflects the hierarchy of guilt and responsibility that governs the realm's operations. Laurence, as the founder and leader of the institution responsible for the hamlet's destruction, bears ultimate responsibility and therefore suffers the most severe and permanent form of punishment. Other figures face consequences proportional to their level of involvement and responsibility. The nightmare also serves as a warning to those in the physical world who might be tempted to follow similar paths. The preservation of the church's crimes and their consequences within the nightmare realm ensures that the truth cannot be permanently hidden or forgotten. Future generations are provided with evidence of what happens when human ambition encounters cosmic forces without adequate humility or restraint. For those who enter the nightmare from the physical world, encountering Laurence serves as both a cautionary tale and a test of understanding. The burning First Vicar represents the ultimate consequence of the choices that led to the church's corruption, and those who face him are forced to confront the reality of what their predecessors' actions have wrought. The battle against Laurence becomes not just a physical confrontation, but a moral reckoning with the legacy of the healing church. The futility of Laurence's situation in the nightmare also reflects broader themes about the nature of cosmic justice and human responsibility. His eternal suffering cannot undo the harm he has caused or restore the lives that were lost due to his actions. The punishment serves not as a means of rehabilitation or restitution, but as a form of cosmic bookkeeping that ensures moral debts are acknowledged and paid. The ultimate message of the hunter's nightmare regarding Laurence and his legacy is one of inevitable cosmic accountability. Despite the church's attempts to hide their crimes, control their narrative, and maintain their authority, the nightmare ensures that the truth is preserved and that justice is ultimately served. The realm stands as proof that there are consequences for actions that violate the fundamental order of existence, even when those consequences are delayed or operate through mechanisms beyond normal human perception. The influence of Laurence extends far beyond his personal transformation and eternal punishment in the hunter's nightmare. Feel yourself becoming even more relaxed now as we explore the lasting impact of his vision. Your mind is quiet, your body is at peace, and the story flows like a lullaby. As the founder and first leader of the healing church, his ideas, methods, and fundamental approach to the old blood shaped an institution that would continue to operate for decades after his death, spreading his vision throughout Yharnam and beyond, while simultaneously amplifying and perpetuating the very problems that had led to his downfall. The healing church that survived Laurence's transformation bore little resemblance to the idealistic organization he had originally envisioned, where he had dreamed of an institution dedicated to healing and human improvement. What remained was a complex bureaucracy primarily concerned with maintaining its own power and influence. The noble goals that had motivated the church's founding had been gradually displaced by more immediate concerns about political control, resource management, and damage containment. Vicar Amelia, who inherited Laurence's title and position many years after his death, exemplifies both the continuity and the corruption of his legacy. Like her predecessor, Amelia genuinely believed in the divine nature of the old blood and the church's mission to administer it for the benefit of humanity. Her prayers and devotions demonstrated a sincere faith in the principles that Laurence had established. Yet her eventual transformation into a beast during the hunt reveals that she had learned nothing from her predecessor's fate. The reverence shown for Laurence's skull in the Grand Cathedral represents perhaps the most tragic aspect of his legacy. The church had transformed their founder into a religious icon, treating his remains as sacred relics that somehow blessed and legitimized their continued operations. This veneration served to obscure, rather than illuminate, the lessons that his fate should have taught, allowing subsequent generations of church leaders to repeat his mistakes while believing they were following his example. The prayers that Amelia offers before Laurence's skull reveal the complete perversion of his original message. Instead of heeding the warnings implicit in his transformation, she asks for his blessing on the continued use of blood ministration. The irony is profound. She seeks guidance from the very person whose experience should have taught her to abandon the practices that led to his corruption. This willful blindness to obvious lessons demonstrates how institutions can become trapped by their own mythology and unable to learn from their founders' failures. The church's development of increasingly elaborate theological justifications for blood ministration represents another aspect of Laurence's problematic legacy, where he had originally promoted the old blood based on its obvious practical benefits. Later church doctrine became increasingly abstract and mystical. Complex theological frameworks were developed to explain away the obvious problems with blood ministration while maintaining faith in its ultimate righteousness. These theological developments served multiple purposes for the Church's leadership. They provided intellectual cover for practices that were becoming increasingly difficult to justify on practical grounds. They created barriers to understanding that prevented ordinary believers from questioning church policies. Most importantly, they allowed church leaders to maintain their own faith in the righteousness of their cause despite mounting evidence of its harmful effects. The evolution of the Hunter's Workshop under church guidance also reflects the transformation of Laurence's legacy over time. What had begun as a practical response to the problems created by blood ministration gradually became an institution primarily concerned with protecting church interests rather than serving the broader community. The noble ideals that Ludwig had brought to hunting were gradually displaced by more pragmatic concerns about maintaining order and eliminating threats to church authority. The development of the choir and the school of mensis as competing factions within the broader church hierarchy demonstrates how Laurence's original unified vision fragmented over time. These organizations, while nominally serving the same institutional goals, pursued radically different approaches to understanding and utilizing cosmic forces. Their rivalry and competition often worked against the Church's stated mission, while consuming resources and attention that might have been better directed toward solving fundamental problems. The choir's research into communication with great ones represents a direct continuation of Laurence's original interest in harnessing cosmic forces for human benefit. However, their methods and goals had evolved far beyond anything Laurence had originally envisioned, where he had focused on the practical medical applications of the old blood. The choir pursued abstract communion with alien intelligences whose motivations and methods were entirely beyond human comprehension. The school of mensis took this evolution even further, pursuing contact with cosmic forces through methods that bordered on summoning and demon worship. Michael Ash's obsession with achieving communication with great ones led him to abandon any pretense of serving human welfare in favor of pursuing cosmic knowledge for its own sake. His eventual fate trapped in his own nightmare construct, while his physical body, mummified, serves as another example of how Laurence's original vision was corrupted by successive generations of followers. The Church's relationship with other institutions and organizations also reflects the problematic aspects of Laurence's legacy. The conflict with the vile bloods of Cainhurst, while ostensibly about competing approaches to blood usage, was fundamentally about power and control rather than genuine theological or medical differences. The Church's use of the executioners to eliminate the vile bloods demonstrates how far the institution had moved from its original healing mission towards simple political domination. The Church's treatment of Old Yharnam, following the Beast Plague outbreak, there reveals another dimension of Laurence's problematic legacy. Rather than attempting to help the infected residents or find solutions to their condition, the Church chose to quarantine the entire district and burn it to eliminate the threat. This response prioritized institutional survival over human welfare and demonstrated how completely the Church had abandoned its original commitment to healing and helping those in need. Durer's rebellion against this approach and his eventual establishment of a sanctuary for the remaining beasts in Old Yharnam represents a rejection of the Church's corrupted interpretation of Laurence's legacy. The retired hunter's decision to protect rather than eliminate the transformed residents reflects a return to the original idealistic principles that had motivated the Church's founding. His actions serve as a reminder of what the Church might have become if it had remained true to its founder's noble intentions. The development of blood ministration techniques and applications over the decades following Laurence's death shows how his original medical innovations were gradually perverted into something far more dangerous and exploitative. What had begun as careful, controlled treatments administered by trained professionals evolved into widespread distribution of increasingly potent blood preparations with minimal oversight or safety precautions. The Church's establishment of blood collection and processing facilities throughout Yharnam created an industrial infrastructure dedicated to the mass production and distribution of old blood-based treatments. This industrialization of what had originally been a careful medical procedure removed much of the personalized attention and safety monitoring that had characterized Laurence's early work. The focus shifted from patient welfare to production efficiency, with predictable consequences for safety and effectiveness. The social and cultural changes that the church promoted in Yharnam society also reflect both the positive and negative aspects of Laurence's legacy. The emphasis on communal worship and shared ritual created strong social bonds and provided meaning and purpose for many citizens. However, the church's growing political influence also created pressure for conformity and discouraged questioning or criticism of church policies. The Night of the Hunt, which became a regular occurrence in Yharnam, represents the institutionalization of violence as a solution to the problems created by the church's own policies. These organized hunts served multiple purposes. They provided an outlet for community fear and anger, demonstrated the church's continued relevance and power, and eliminated threats to church authority. However, they also normalized violence and created a culture where killing was seen as an acceptable first resort rather than a last option. The psychological impact of regular hunts on Yharnam's population cannot be overstated. Citizens were required to participate in or at least support organized campaigns to kill their neighbors, friends, and family members who had undergone beast transformation. This requirement created trauma, paranoia, and social fragmentation that undermined the community bonds that the church claimed to support. The church's development of increasingly sophisticated propaganda and indoctrination techniques also represents an evolution from Laurence's original approach. Where he had relied primarily on demonstrable results to build support for blood ministration, later church leaders invested heavily in messaging, symbolism, and ritual designed to maintain faith, even when practical results were disappointing or harmful. The architectural legacy of the church, particularly the expansion and elaboration of the Grand Cathedral, serves as a physical manifestation of how Laurence's vision was both honored and corrupted by his successors. The magnificent building that grew from his original modest structure represents the institutional success that his innovations had made possible. However, the increasingly elaborate and intimidating design also reflects the church's transformation from a healing organization into an institution primarily concerned with projecting power and authority. The preservation and display of various relics and artifacts within the cathedral creates a museum-like atmosphere that transforms the church's history into objects of veneration rather than sources of learning. Laurence's skull, the various blood-related artifacts, and the elaborate ceremonial objects serve to create an atmosphere of mystical reverence that discourages critical examination of the church's actual track record and effectiveness. The church's influence on education and intellectual development in Yharnam also reflects the mixed nature of Laurence's legacy. On one hand, the church supported scholarship, research, and learning in ways that genuinely advanced human knowledge and capability. On the other hand, the institution's growing orthodoxy and intolerance for dissent gradually constrained intellectual freedom and discouraged the kind of independent thinking that had originally led to breakthrough discoveries. The fate of scholars and researchers who questioned church doctrine or proposed alternative approaches demonstrates how the institution that had emerged from Laurence's rebellion against orthodoxy had itself become a source of intellectual oppression. The irony is particularly bitter given Laurence's own history as a scholar who had challenged his master's teachings in pursuit of what he believed was a better approach. The international reputation and influence of the healing church during its height represents the global scope of Laurence's impact. Pilgrims and patients traveled to Yharnam from distant lands, seeking the benefits of blood ministration, spreading knowledge of the church's methods and philosophy throughout the known world. This international influence amplified both the positive and negative aspects of Laurence's innovations. The gradual decline of the church's effectiveness and authority in its later years reflects the inevitable collapse of an institution built on fundamentally flawed premises. Despite decades of effort, resources, and innovation, the church never succeeded in solving the basic problems that Laurence's original blood ministration had created. The beast scourge continued to spread, transformations became more common and severe, and the institution's credibility gradually eroded as its failures became impossible to hide or explain away. The final irony of Laurence's legacy lies in how completely his original vision was vindicated by its own failure. Willem's warnings about the dangers of the old blood proved prophetic in every detail, while Laurence's confidence in his ability to safely harness cosmic forces was revealed to be tragically misplaced. Yet this vindication came too late to prevent the enormous suffering and destruction that resulted from pursuing the wrong path for so long. The story of Laurence's legacy serves as a case study in how good intentions can lead to catastrophic outcomes when they encounter forces beyond human understanding or control. His genuine desire to help humanity and his remarkable early successes created momentum for an institutional trajectory that ultimately led to widespread harm and suffering. The church that carried his name and claimed to follow his example became a source of the very problems it was supposed to solve. Understanding Laurence's legacy is crucial for understanding the broader themes of Bloodborne's narrative. His story illustrates how human ambition and cosmic forces can interact in ways that produce outcomes far different from those intended by the original actors. It demonstrates the importance of humility and caution when dealing with powers beyond human comprehension, and the dangers of allowing institutional momentum to override critical thinking and moral reflection. The First Vicar's ultimate legacy is thus a complex mixture of inspiration and warning. His original vision of using knowledge and innovation to improve human existence remains admirable and worth pursuing. However, his fate and the consequences of his actions serve as a permanent reminder of the need for wisdom, restraint, and respect for forces that operate according to logic beyond human understanding or control. As we reach the conclusion of our journey through the life and legacy of Laurence, the First Vicar, it becomes clear that his story serves as far more than just the biography of a single character within Bloodborne's intricate narrative. Let yourself drift now, completely relaxed, as we reflect on the deeper meanings of this tragic tale. Instead, Laurence's tale functions as a profound meditation on the nature of human ambition, the dangers of cosmic exploration, and the tragic irony that often accompanies our most noble intentions when they encounter forces beyond our comprehension. The arc of Laurence's existence, from idealistic scholar to church founder to monstrous beast to eternally burning phantom, traces a complete cycle of human aspiration and cosmic consequence. His transformation represents not just a personal tragedy, but a universal warning about the hubris that drives humanity to reach beyond its natural limitations without adequate preparation or understanding of the forces being unleashed. At its heart, Laurence's story is about the corruption of knowledge and the perversion of healing. The man who began his career dedicated to alleviating human suffering ultimately became responsible for creating new and more terrible forms of suffering that persisted long after his own death. This transformation was not the result of evil intentions or moral weakness, but rather emerged from the interaction between noble goals and cosmic forces that operated according to logic entirely alien to human understanding. The relationship between Laurence and Master Willem serves as a framework for understanding the broader themes of the narrative. Willem's cautious approach to cosmic knowledge, symbolized by his warning to fear the old blood, represents one possible response to encounters with forces beyond human comprehension. His emphasis on gaining insight and understanding before attempting to manipulate or utilize cosmic power reflects a recognition of humanity's limitations and the need for humility when dealing with such forces. Laurence's more aggressive approach, by contrast, represents the human tendency to focus on immediate practical benefits without adequate consideration of long-term consequences or underlying dangers. His confidence in his ability to safely harness the old blood's power reflects a fundamentally anthropocentric worldview that assumes human intelligence and determination can overcome any obstacle or danger. The tragedy of their conflict lies not in any fundamental moral difference between the two men, but in their different assessments of risk and their different approaches to the unknown. Both Willem and Laurence genuinely wanted to benefit humanity and advance human knowledge. Their disagreement centered on questions of method and timing rather than ultimate goals. Yet this seemingly academic dispute had consequences that extended far beyond the scholarly realm and ultimately affected the fate of an entire civilization. The healing church that emerged from Laurence's vision serves as a case study in how institutions can evolve in ways that contradict their founding principles. What began as a genuine effort to provide healing and improvement gradually transformed into a complex bureaucracy primarily concerned with maintaining its own power and authority. This institutional evolution was not the result of conscious corruption or deliberate abandonment of original values, but rather emerged from the practical pressures of dealing with the unintended consequences of the Church's core activities. The beast scourge that plagued Yharnam represents more than just a medical or public health crisis. It serves as a metaphor for the unintended consequences of technological and scientific advancement more generally. The same old blood that provided miraculous healing also carried within it the seeds of transformation and corruption. This duality reflects the double-edged nature of many human innovations, which often carry both tremendous benefits and hidden dangers that only become apparent over time. The Church's response to the beast scourge attempting to manage its consequences rather than addressing its root causes illustrates a common pattern in human institutional behavior. Once organizations become committed to particular approaches or technologies, they often prefer to address problems through additional complexity and control, rather than abandoning or fundamentally revising their core strategies. This institutional inertia can perpetuate and amplify problems even when their causes are well understood. The hunter's workshop and the culture of hunting that developed around it represent another dimension of how Laurence's original vision was corrupted over time. What began as a practical response to a specific problem gradually evolved into an institution with its own values, traditions, and interests that often conflicted with the Church's stated mission. The hunters who were supposed to protect society from the consequences of blood ministration became, in many cases, victims of the same forces they were fighting against. Ludwig's transformation from noble hunter to monstrous beast serves as a particularly poignant example of how even the most sincere and dedicated individuals could be corrupted by the system they served. His fate illustrates that good intentions and strong character are not sufficient protection against cosmic forces that operate according to logic beyond human understanding. The very blood that gave him the strength to serve others ultimately destroyed his humanity and transformed him into a threat to those he had sworn to protect. The atrocities committed at the Fishing Hamlet represent the nadir of the Church's moral decline and illustrate how institutional pressures can lead even good people to participate in unconscionable actions. The scholars and hunters who participated in the Hamlet's destruction were not inherently evil individuals, but rather were caught up in institutional dynamics that gradually normalized and justified increasingly extreme actions in service of supposedly noble goals. The cosmic justice represented by the hunter's nightmare serves as a reminder that there are moral laws operating in the universe that transcend human institutions and human understanding. The nightmare's existence demonstrates that actions have consequences that extend beyond the physical realm and beyond human awareness. The eternal punishment suffered by Laurence and his compatriots illustrates that cosmic justice operates according to principles that may be very different from human notions of fairness or proportionality. Yet the nightmare also serves as a source of hope in that it demonstrates that truth cannot be permanently hidden and that justice will ultimately be served, even if that justice operates through mechanisms beyond human understanding or control. The preservation of the Fishing Hamlet within the nightmare ensures that the truth about the Church's crimes cannot be forgotten or denied, regardless of attempts to suppress or rewrite history. The role of Great Ones throughout Laurence's story serves as a reminder of humanity's place within a much larger cosmic order. These alien intelligences operate according to motivations and logic that are fundamentally incomprehensible to human minds. Their influence on human affairs is neither benevolent nor malevolent in any human sense, but rather reflects the operation of cosmic forces that exist on scales and according to principles that transcend human categories of understanding. The old blood itself serves as a symbol of the ambiguous nature of cosmic gifts. Its healing properties were genuine and provided real benefits to those who received it, yet it also carried within it influences and tendencies that ultimately proved destructive to human civilization. This duality reflects the complex nature of contact with cosmic forces. Such contact may provide genuine benefits, but it also inevitably involves risks and consequences that cannot be fully predicted or controlled. The concept of insight that runs throughout Bloodborne's narrative serves as another lens for understanding Laurence's story. Insight represents knowledge and understanding that comes at a cost. The more one learns about cosmic truth, the more one becomes alienated from ordinary human existence. Laurence's tragedy can be understood as the result of gaining too much insight too quickly, without the wisdom or preparation necessary to handle such knowledge safely. Willem's approach of seeking insight gradually and carefully, while developing the wisdom necessary to handle cosmic knowledge, represents a more sustainable approach to transcendence. However, his fate becoming a mute, mushroom-covered figure trapped in contemplation suggests that even the most careful approach to cosmic knowledge carries risks and costs that may ultimately prove unacceptable. The theme of eyes that appears throughout the narrative serves as a metaphor for different types of knowledge and understanding. The eyes on the inside that Willem promoted represent a form of cosmic perception that allows individuals to see beyond ordinary human limitations. However, the development of such perception comes at the cost of normal human consciousness and social connection. The choice between gaining cosmic insight and maintaining human identity represents one of the fundamental dilemmas explored in Laurence's story. The architectural elements that appear throughout the narrative. The Grand Cathedral, the Research Hall, the Hunter's Workshop serve as physical manifestations of different approaches to cosmic knowledge and power. These structures represent human attempts to create controlled environments for dealing with cosmic forces, yet they ultimately prove inadequate to contain or control the powers they were designed to channel. The various weapons and tools developed by the Church and its hunters serve as metaphors for humanity's attempts to assert control over forces beyond their understanding. The trick weapons that transform to meet different challenges represent human adaptability and ingenuity. Yet even the most sophisticated weapons prove inadequate against truly cosmic threats. The ultimate ineffectiveness of human tools against cosmic forces serves as another reminder of humanity's limitations and the need for humility when dealing with such powers. The role of ritual and ceremony throughout the Church's operations serves as an example of how human institutions attempt to create meaning and control in the face of incomprehensible forces. The elaborate rituals surrounding blood ministration serve both practical and psychological functions, helping to create a sense of order and purpose around activities that were ultimately chaotic and unpredictable. The corruption of language and meaning that occurs throughout the Church's evolution illustrates how institutions can gradually lose sight of their original purposes through the accumulation of small compromises and rationalizations. Terms like healing and ministry gradually acquired new meanings that bore little resemblance to their original definitions, allowing the Church to maintain its self-image as a beneficial institution, even as its actual effects became increasingly harmful. The persistence of Laurence's influence long after his death demonstrates how ideas and institutions can take on lives of their own that extend far beyond their creator's intentions or control. The Church that claimed to follow his example bore little resemblance to his original vision, yet his name and legacy continued to provide legitimacy for actions he would have found abhorrent. The ultimate message of Laurence's story is both warning and invitation. It serves as a cautionary tale about the dangers of cosmic exploration without adequate preparation, wisdom, and humility. Yet it also represents an acknowledgement that such exploration is an inevitable part of human nature, and that the quest for knowledge and improvement, despite its risks, remains a fundamentally noble endeavor. The tragedy of Laurence lies not in his decision to pursue cosmic knowledge, but in his failure to appreciate the full implications of what he was attempting. His story suggests that contact with cosmic forces is not inherently good or evil, but rather represents a fundamental challenge that requires the highest levels of wisdom, preparation, and moral reflection to navigate safely. For those who encounter Laurence's story, whether in the burning cathedral of the Hunter's Nightmare or in the veneration of his skull in the Grand Cathedral, his fate serves as both inspiration and warning. His original vision of using knowledge and power to benefit humanity remains worthy of pursuit, but his tragic end reminds us that such pursuits must be undertaken with the deepest respect for forces beyond our understanding and the humility to acknowledge our own limitations. And so, we come to the end of our journey through the tragic tale of Laurence, the First Vicar. We've discovered how a brilliant scholar's noble intentions became the foundation for cosmic horror, how healing became corruption, how the pursuit of transcendence led to damnation. The legacy of Laurence continues to burn in the nightmare realm, an eternal reminder of the price of hubris and the dangerous allure of forbidden knowledge. His story echoes through the blood-soaked streets of Yharnam, a warning written in flame and suffering. It speaks to the eternal human struggle between ambition and wisdom, between the desire to improve our condition and the need to respect forces beyond our comprehension. In the end, Laurence's tale is a reminder that the noblest intentions, when mixed with cosmic power, can create the most terrible outcomes. Rest now, dear hunter. Let the story settle into your mind like snow falling on ancient stones. Let the lessons of Laurence's fate drift through your consciousness as you descend into peaceful sleep. The tale is complete. The fire burns eternal. And somewhere, in a nightmare realm beyond our reach, the First Vicar continues his endless suffering, a monument to human ambition and cosmic justice. May you find peace in your dreams tonight, unburdened by the weight of knowledge too great to bear. May you rest deeply, knowing that some mysteries are better left unexplored, some powers better left untouched, and may the old blood never find its way into your veins, corrupting noble purpose into monstrous transformation. Good night, dear hunter. Good night. Until we meet again, in another tale of cosmic horror and human tragedy, sleep well.